Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the D in WhatIf, with another fanfiction. This is the movie of what if Deku becomes the selfless healer in a vigilante world. All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. So Izuku sighed as he sketched out Kachin, drawing him in the middle of using his quirk as he continued to write down his analysis of him. The teacher was talking about something, but he was too busy writing his analysis in code. It took a bit more brainpower to translate things into code. It was easy to decode, harder to code. Izuku contemplated that for only a second before he heard Kachin make an exclamation of confusion. He looked up for a second to see everyone staring at him. Oh, they must have mentioned his wish to get into UA. If Izuku was honest, he knew it was a pipe dream. He had known since he turned 13. He couldn't help himself. He clung to the childish dream, wishing desperately despite knowing it was useless. Like he was. He shook his head to clear it, listening to Kachin go off on him. His mind was lagging behind his mouth. He was spouting excuses and cowering before the flashy blonde. If he was honest, he barely heard Kachin. Whenever a lot of the students started to talk, it just sounded like the buzz of a fly. They always repeated the same things. Useless, quirkless, Midoriya is so stupid. Why does he think he can get into UA? He's so delusional, he must be challenged. Midoriya needs to learn his place. Useless is trying to do something again. Useless is trying to overcome his title. Useless tried to be useful. Stay away from Useless. You might catch whatever he has. At some point, it had all become background noise. Izuku blinked, realizing Kachin was right in front of him, his hands letting off explosions as the other teen stared down at him. He was looking at him as if he was a particularly disgusting bug. Izuku looked at Kachin, and the other's eyes widened for a second, staring at him as if seeing him for the first time. Izuku wondered what Kachin saw before speaking. "What was it you said?" he asked simply as he stared up at his friend. Izuku pondered his intelligence at that thought. He still called Kachin, Kachin, in his head. He still thought of him as a friend. Was this how friends treated each other? He questioned inside his mind. He was barely aware enough to realize everyone was laughing at his question. Kachin stared at him for another second before speaking. "Tusk? Whatever. Obviously, you're too stupid to even understand what I'm saying. So I'll be the only one getting into UA," he exclaimed, turning back to his minions. Izuku didn't answer, merely staring at Kachin's back. Maybe he should stop calling Kachin by that nickname. He wondered whether he'd care, how he'd react if the next time he saw him he called him Bakugo. He went back to his notebook. The only reason he noticed when class was over was that people didn't bother to try not to bump into his desk, nearly making him drag his pencil across the page. He managed to stop that from happening as he packed his bag. Kachin glanced at him as if contemplating something. He made a noise of dismissal before leaving the room. Kachin paused at the door, before casually giving him some passing advice. Advice that involved a roof, jumping, and the bizarre notion of the next life. Izuku watched Kachin leave, wondering whether he was spiteful enough to write a note and take that advice. However, it seemed like that was too much. Izuku reasoned that it wasn't because he was still inexplicably attached to the childhood friend he used to go exploring with, used to play heroes with, until a simple X-ray managed to label him quirkless, a death sentence. His social life died with that simple word. As soon as it was spoken, any child's hope of being his friend was beaten to death. Izuku hummed to himself as he walked home. No one would know, a few minutes later, that a sludge villain came from the drain he passed. No one would know that Izuku just barely missed meeting his childhood idol, barely missed having his dreams shattered by the same idol, barely missed accidentally freeing the villain again and having to save his childhood friend, and barely missed being offered one for all. What Izuku didn't miss, as he navigated the mildly dangerous alleyways on his way home many weeks later, was a young adult in a black hoodie which was pulled up to hide his face. He could see stray strands of blue hair. He could also see the way they were sitting, pressing their hand to their side, hand covered in blood. Izuku was a gentle soul at heart, always wanting to help. It was why he liked All Might, why he hated Endeavor, why he enjoyed finding the bits and pieces of information about underground heroes. Izuku looked at the adult and spoke up. "You seem to be in a bit of trouble. I could help." He lost confidence halfway through. He tried to calm himself down as the adult looked at him, red eyes focusing on his face. "I could help you," he repeated, a bit louder than he meant to. The adult blinked slowly, staring at him. Izuku wondered whether the other was already experiencing the effects of too much blood loss. However, the adult answered before he could move. "I guess it couldn't hurt to let an NPC like you help." The other spoke, causing Izuku to start. However, Izuku rushed to move over and help him. Izuku moved the other's hoodie up so he could see the wound. He laid a hand on the other's side as he took his backpack off, opening it one-handed and searching for the medicine he kept on hand to treat the wounds he got from being beaten up. The other watched him, so Izuku started talking to try and make it less awkward. So, what's your quirk? He asked, keeping one hand on the other's side as he began to clean the wound with a water bottle. The other didn't seem to mind talking about his quirk, telling him what it was after just a second or two of contemplation. Izuku asked questions about the other's quirk and offered different ways he could use the quirk. He offered ideas he had about the quirk, and they chatted back and forth about the other's quirk, never once mentioning Izuku's own quirk. Izuku glanced back down at the wound, pausing as he noticed the wound was healed. It hadn't been as bad as he had expected in the first place, but it sure as hell shouldn't have been healed. Izuku blinked, before beginning to continue to bandage the other. He didn't want to mention it. He felt he should keep it to himself for a bit longer, just until he could figure out what the hell that meant. He shifted, grabbing a painkiller and giving it to the other, doing everything within view of the other. It was even a new bottle of painkillers, though only Tamura really noticed that, taking note of the fact because that meant that they weren't replaced with something else. It also meant that either this brat needed painkillers really often, or they never needed painkillers. But with the fact that it seemed the brat had a first aid kit in their backpack, Tamura didn't want to know the full extent of it. Meanwhile, Izuku was mindlessly packing everything away. The painkillers should work in a few minutes. I'll be heading home now, and just know I'm sorry. Izuku, of course, was referring to the fact that the other was actually fully healed, but he was deceiving him. The other was visibly confused. Izuku got up and left quickly, leaving the other in the alleyway. Izuku went home, while Tamura got picked up by Kurogiri after a simple text. Izuku was confused as he sat down on the couch in his home. His mother wasn't there. She often spent long hours doing work. Izuku was kind of relieved because that meant she didn't have time to inquire as to what was going on with him. But he was also a burden that would never go away unless he died. Izuku quickly shook off those thoughts. He had already registered to take the entrance exams for UA. He was going to do what he could with what he had. He went to his bedroom and sat at his computer, staring into the dark screen for a second. His own face stared back at him, tired, hungry, thirsty. He frowned at his needs, shaking them off. He should probably take a shower tonight. He turned on the computer and began to type. Useless the useful. What does it mean when while you're helping someone with a wound they suddenly are healed? SL33PIS34K. Do they have a healing quirk? Z4PD0S. Use. What are you talking about? Why are you awake? It's like 2 a.m. Useless the useful. They don't have a healing quirk, and I have a second toe joint. SL33PIS34K. Why does the toe jaunt matter? T0 Esther. Lol. What? Also, Zap. SR Sly. SL33PIS34K. Joined. Useless useful. Isn't that the usual way of telling whether someone is quirkless? T0 Esther. SR Sly. You think THT BLL shit is true. Thought UW are the smart one. Useless useful. What are you even talking about toast? T0 Esther. First, it's toast. Second, THT doesn't make you QR class. JSD is Unkman and QR CAD PPL. SL33PIS34K. Yay, use if someone just labeled you quirkless after seeing the toe joint PLZ, go sue them. You have a healing quirk, apparently. Though analysis and info, I thought you had a info quirk. Useless the useful. I think my world has just been turned upside down. I need to take a bit to just. Izuku closed the chat. It was a local forum, mostly to discuss heroes and hero-related stuff. This often means the politics behind the heroes. This also meant they discussed the villains. However, Izuku was too busy reeling from that revelation to even go through and add to his notebook. Izuku felt like he was gonna be sick. All of this, just because the doctor was lazy. Izuku felt like the world was spinning, like everything was about to collapse around him. He felt tears burning in his eyes. He stood, only to feel the world wobble. Okay, maybe all these feelings weren't just because of the revelation. He swallowed dryly, before stumbling to the kitchen. He grabbed a glass and filled it with water. He began to gulp down the water, drinking it like this was his last chance to. He continued to drink from the glass as he opened the fridge and got some microwavable junk food from it. He took it out and followed the microwaving instructions. He thought about the revelation. He had a quirk. He probably had one this whole time. His quirk had healed a stab wound. This gave him pause. He had helped someone. Izuku felt like celebrating. He had helped someone. He then felt like panicking, because it was illegal quirk usage. But why was quirk usage illegal? He understood for certain people with dangerous quirks, who could hurt people if they used them improperly. He unconsciously rubbed his shoulder where Kachin had burned him, having healed over and probably scarred. But what about people who couldn't help it? What about the young adult he had just helped who couldn't help but destroy everything? What about him? He hadn't even tried to heal that man. He had just done it. Izuku paused. He didn't know anything about his quirk. He decided he needed to spend more time researching. He needed to learn before he could do much else. He also knew the perfect place. He knew a place where a lot of animals ended up injured, where a lot of people ended up injured. His home was near this place. He could walk into that shady part of town and help people. He smiled a bit before going to get one of his quirk biology books. He had a few biology books, mostly on humans, so he could learn more about how quirks affected them. However, he did have a decent amount on animals. Animals could have quirks, and that was absolutely amazing to Izuku. Now he couldn't wait for tomorrow. Forgetting about the food in the microwave, he went to his bedroom to study. Later that night, Midoriya sighed as she opened the door. It was 4 a.m. She had received a text from Izuku at 7 p.m. that he was probably just gonna spend some time near home, maybe do some shopping. She walked into a silent house. She smiled as she went to check on Izuku. She confirmed that he was in his room, evidence being his peaceful breathing. After this, she went to get some food. She noticed the food in the microwave, not knowing whether Izuku meant this for her or whether he made it for himself but forgot about it. She assumed he was asleep from his peaceful breathing, and thought that maybe he had fallen asleep while making it. However, now it had sat inside the microwave too long and wasn't any good. She sighed as she threw it away. She made herself some food, leaving some for Izuku in the morning. She went to her bedroom, pausing outside Izuku's door. She was honestly so proud of her son. He was so smart and brilliant, and he was just such a good boy. She swore that he had the brightest stars shining in his eyes every time she looked at them. She just wished she could be around more. She had to work long hours to make enough money. Sometimes, she was worried about Izuku. She couldn't help it. He was a quirkless boy in a quirked world. She swallowed slightly as she passed the door. Her hand had hovered inches from the doorknob, debating opening it just a bit to just look at her baby. But she couldn't. She couldn't bring herself to look at him and know that the world wouldn't accommodate him. The world would try to reject him like he was a virus. If she had opened the door, she might have seen that her baby wasn't asleep. Her baby was staring mindlessly at a phone, tracking incidents, learning. He was absorbing knowledge. He knew he was smart. He just couldn't stop. He needed to keep pushing. He had no time to sleep. He had no time to stop. Maybe, if Inko had opened the door, she would have realized that the stars in her son's eyes were blinding him. She might have been able to do something. But fate is predestined. And Izuku Midoriya was always someone who was supposed to shine. Izuku sighs as he finishes healing the small bird he had found uselessly flitting about with one of their wings horrendously scratched up. He'd been feeding the local animals. It was one of the few ways he could convince them to approach even if they were injured. Normally he wouldn't get to them until the wound was very severe. Izuku released the bird, which flew away in terror. Izuku chuckled, quietly saying to himself, "Not even a thank you." This was mostly a joke, so he was surprised to hear a familiar voice respond. "Well, little healer, the wild mobs aren't usually all that grateful. Which makes me wonder why you're healing them at all. It isn't like you can trade it for info on their quirks like you did mine." The blue-haired adult spoke from behind him, spooking Izuku a bit. He jumped slightly and turned, getting up from his spot on his knees. He was usually on his knees when he was attending to the animals. It made them feel more at ease. "Oh, I was testing my quirk," he said slowly, looking to the side as he awkwardly edged away. Izuku was smart enough to know the adult in front of him was not good in any way. He was scarred and wore ratty clothes and talked in game references. Most people who were like that were either villains or very introverted. Since the other had done something to get himself stabbed, he was leaning more towards the villain side of things. "Yeah, I was wondering why you bandaged me at all if you were just gonna heal it like that," the adult said casually. "Oh, and what if?" He trailed off for a second. "What if I don't really feel like telling you?" Izuku questioned, backing up a few more steps. The adult tensed up as if they were gonna chase him, and Izuku got prepared to run. The other seemed to notice this and shifted slightly, relaxing. "Well, what if I ask about my quirk?" "Oh, did you try anything I suggested?" Izuku asked excitedly as he moved forward a bit, unable to help himself when it came to quirks. "Oh, yeah. Well, I tried it on a few different materials. A few things seem to go quicker than others. I don't have the biggest range." The other responded to Izuku, smirking. "Oh, that's cool. Are pure metals quicker or slower?" Izuku asked excitedly, looking at the other. "Slow down there, healer. Why don't you tell me more about your quirk?" The other said, still smirking as he stepped forward and grabbed Izuku on his neck with 4 fingers. Izuku let out a small noise in surprise, before quickly beginning to stumble through his speech. He hadn't realized he had gotten so close to the stranger. "Oh, please don't." He protested the other's grip on his neck. However, he still gripped harder, lowering the 5th finger a bit. Izuku rushed, "Look, I didn't know until that night. I have barely begun to understand it now." Izuku protests as he squirms a bit. The blue-haired adult stared at him for a second. He pursed his lips before releasing him. Izuku quickly took a few steps back, rubbing his neck nervously, as if checking it was still there. While the other paused. "What did you say your name was?" he questioned. However, Izuku didn't answer, instead taking off down an alleyway. Tamura swore as he began to follow the kid. Izuku took off down the alleyway, scanning either side for anything he could use. He found a pile of boxes and quickly tore them down, collapsing them in front of the other who was trying to chase him down while texting someone. He grabbed one box and threw it specifically at their head while still running, stumbling a bit. He rolled to keep himself moving forward, quickly getting back up onto his feet and turning down an offshoot. Leaving behind the villain who surely would be annoyed at him might not have been the smartest idea. He even risked pissing them off. However, he couldn't help it. He had no insurance that the other wouldn't do anything. And this part of town cleared out and was abandoned by this time of day. No one would open their mouth if Izuku had crumbled to dust. And he really just wanted to understand his quirk. If he had to die, he just wanted to understand his quirk first. Izuku didn't stop running until his sides and his legs burned. His vision swam and Izuku almost felt like laughing. He had forgotten to eat again. He stumbled a bit as he walked forward. He went over what he knew about his quirk to distract himself from the pain. Normally thinking about quirks worked, and this time it worked especially well. He knew that his quirk worked slower on animals he knew less about. It still healed them, but it was slow, and if he knew nothing about them, they often healed wrong. He winced, thinking about the butterfly with the torn wing he had tried to heal. He was kind of glad that his sympathy wasn't as strong with insects as it was with other animals, but it was still bad, seeing the poor butterfly like that. He had to leave. He was almost certain it died. It couldn't reach any flowers. Some of the animals he had named healed well, like Dusk, a tuxedo cat who had such a commanding air about her that he couldn't help but notice her. She had ended up with a damaged tail recently, and it had barely taken him any time at all to heal it. Dusk often walked with him when he was in the bad part of town. Dusk hadn't been there today, but it was probably because she was doing something. He hoped she hadn't gotten herself caught, or if she did, it was a TNR program. She didn't belong in a house. Izuku shook the thought of Dusk out of his head. He'd probably ask the hero for him later. He was sure that at least some of them worked in the local shelter. Izuku focused on his quirk again. He healed humans better, a lot better than any of the animals. He tried to figure out the difference, but the only thing he could come up with was that he had extensively researched humans and the connection their quirks had to their biology, because humans just seemed to have quirks more often. Izuku sighed as he concluded. His quirk was completely based on knowledge. He knew a lot about muscle and skin structure and had been able to heal that man because of it. He knew enough to heal the animals, but he didn't know nearly enough about a butterfly to even begin to know how to help that poor butterfly with its wing. Izuku sighed as he put his hand over his mouth, making sure that no one heard him as he was probably mumbling. That was until he ran face first into a building and was completely snapped out of it. He winced, rubbing his face. Oh, yeah, he remembered now. His healing ability didn't extend to himself. That was a bit weird, but he didn't know how to fix that. He sighed as he went home. He had to prepare to get his ass kicked in the UA exam tomorrow. He wondered whether he would get any sleep tonight, but decided he didn't have time to sleep. He never had enough time. Izuku felt like slamming his head into the wall. One hand crept into his hair. He grabbed a fistful, holding it tight enough that he felt it pull on the roots. He focused on the steady pressure of that for a second, his other hand slipping up to do the same. He stopped walking to have his mental breakdown, thinking about the hours in the day, wondering how many he wasted. He wondered how much of people's time he wasted. Why did people waste time on him? That adult had wasted so much time on him. He was useless. No person should be looking at him for more than a second. Useless wasn't worth it. Useless paused for a second. He was wasting more time. Useless took a second, closing his eyes and taking a deep breath. Izuku opened his eyes, releasing his hair. Izuku's eyes were empty, a dead green color without their usual stars. Izuku moved robotically towards his home, dodging out of the way of a few people. He stared ahead, unlocking the door of his home. He opened the door, stepping inside. He turned around to lock the door again. There was a noise from the kitchen and he stopped. The world seemed to spin before clicking back into place. Izuku's eyes sprang to life again, green suddenly, the vibrant emeralds that people would say shone like stars. He smiled as he walked into the kitchen and greeted his mom. "Dinner will be done in 20 minutes, she said with a smile as she looked at her son. Useless couldn't help but think that his mother worked so hard for him and he paid her back by being useless. Useless shouldn't be around people. However, Izuku merely smiled. "Okay, Mom. I'll be in my room, working on a few mods," Izuku said. Izuku turned, ignoring Useless for now. Useless usually complained inwardly. Useless would never dare complain outward. Useless didn't deserve it. Izuku walked into the room, sitting down and texting. Useless useful. Did anyone find a cat that looks like this? Useless useful. She's called Dusk. I was taking care of her for a bit. Too little. I haven't seen her at the shelter. Too little. Don't you think she might just have not felt like approaching? SL33 PIS 34K. Do you live round WHR? She is. SL33 PIS 34K. PRTTY. Sure, I've seen HR round. Useless useful. Oh, I just head over there to help some of the animals. They get hurt a lot. SL33 PIS 34K. Yeah, and T said TH animals SMD2 BBTTR. Z4PD0S WTF sleep are worse than fucking toast. T0 Esther toast. Z4PD0S what type of fucking monster are you? T0 Esther the best kind. SL33 PIS 34K. Case UDDNTNTC TXDHLFSLP. Too little, I'll let you know, use, if she shows up. Useless useful, thanks. Any info on the new heroes? Cats and bags. If you keep asking about hero info, PPL are gonna think you're a villain fishing for info on heroes to defeat. Useless useful, refer to the first part of my username for the answer to that. T0 Esther, use I don't THNK or okay. Useless useful, thanks for the obvious, lol. SL33 PIS 34K. Who hurt you? Izuku quickly logged off, not wanting to bother with that. No one had ever done anything he didn't deserve. Useless deserved it. Izuku took a deep breath before diving into code. Code was easy. Izuku could do a lot with it. Izuku had once hacked the police department. The next day there had been quite a flurry of activity from the police scanner he had hijacked. Izuku stood when his mother called, stopping whatever project he had in its tracks. It didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that mom had called him and he needed to eat now, if only to keep up appearances. Izuku knew his mom was concerned because the amount of food they had wasn't going down the amount it should be for a growing teenage boy. Izuku didn't remember when he had started forgetting to eat, though he knew it was only after his mom started working the long hours. Not that he could blame her. He would never blame her. He couldn't blame her for anything. Not for not believing in him. Not for not saying the words he desperately needed when he was slowly falling apart on the inside. He was okay now, no matter what they told him. Though, his lack of food was probably why he was quite small for his age. He was almost unbelievably short, over half a foot shorter than the average 55. He stood at 49, and he could honestly only blame himself for it. He hadn't eaten enough to grow to the typical height of a teenager his age. He was contemplating this as he ate, having long since gotten rid of any habits that may clue his mother into any of his thoughts. He didn't want to burden her with those, too. He chewed slowly, savoring the taste. He finished way too soon, but also way too late. He hated how conflicted he was inwardly, but took it with stride, much like everything else in his life. He picked up his dishes as he stood, reassuring his mother even as she opened her mouth to protest that she would get it. She was cut off as she took a breath, and for the first time in years looked twice at Izuku. Izuku was suddenly quite on edge. It wasn't that his mother didn't care, it was just that she wasn't around enough. It wasn't her fault, it was honestly his. If he wasn't around, she probably wouldn't have to work such long hours. Izuku smiled at his mother, hoping to put her worries at ease. It's no problem, Mom. I just want to give back a little for everything you do for me, he said with a smile, his blinding brilliant smile that made people stop questioning him when he was younger and was patching himself up outside an alleyway, laughing it off as some kids were playing rough. People would tut and say something about boys being boys, and walk away from the child tending to burn wounds. It didn't happen often, but it happened enough for him to master this blinding smile. As he got older, he got better at hiding them. He stopped that line of thought by placing his dishes in the sink. His hands itched to wash the dishes, if only so his mother didn't have to clean up after him. But that would worry his mother more, and he didn't need her worrying over him. If she left before cleaning, he'd do it. She was probably surprised that she came home to the house cleaned every time. He was just a ghost in his own home. Not out of necessity, but out of worry. He returned to his room in silence, muttering to himself about a quirk to try and put his mother's worries to rest. Was it deceitful? Yes. Did he care? No. This was for his mother. She didn't need to bother with him. He smiled, thinking about his quirk. He could help people now. He repeated it, a bit louder in his mind, his heart swelling with an unfamiliar emotion, long forgotten in the sands of time which seemed to sweep away good all too often. A brilliant smile split his face, none of it faked as he sat down. He opened the chat, seeing a few other people had said something. SL33 PIS 34K, use. Say something, bud. Cats and bags, I think you scared him off. SL33 PIS 34K, what? How? T0 Esther. PPL don't usually like when their insecurity is called out publicly. SL33 PIS 34K, aw fuck. T0 Esther, you had me pretty worried there. Sleep thought someone replaced you with how you were TX'd. Musician for life, is our resident quirk analyst okay? See through, I don't think what he is could be described as okay. And Jen, I am severely concerned for useless useful, and T0 Esther. T0 Esther, wait, why me? And Jen, I am concerned about you because you seem to lack in all types of grammar and seem to thoroughly enjoy putting horrific images in people's minds. T0 Esther, neither of those are causes for concern. Triple it, one of those are causes for concern. and I refuse to state which. Floff, shouldn't we be focusing on use? Izuku decided to say something to completely distract them, hopefully taking all attention off of him. Useless, useful. How many of us are doing the UA exams? ZG girl, me. T0 Esther, I. And Jen, I will be doing the UA entrance exams. Triplet, I. Floff, I will too. Z4PD0S, I hope to. I also want to know who all of us are. And Jen, reminder not to share any civilian names on this, as it is a public chat. Cats and bags, I will not. SL33 PIS 34K, why not? I'll be taking it. Cats and bags, that is for me to know and you to find out. Sugar to cope, I will. Musician for life, I really wanna, and I probably will. Too fab for you, moi. Too little, I will, too. Use, what about you? Izuku was floored. How could they turn this back on him? How was he supposed to answer, especially with them all already concerned about him? He couldn't answer that with a completely truthful answer, could he? Izuku paused, considering. He thought about it for a few minutes before typing his answer so no one got too concerned. Useless, useful, I will be attempting to, but I don't expect to get into the hero course, so I'll probably be in Gen Ed. If any of you can figure out who I am, I'd be more than happy to talk to you guys. D. Cats and bags, you are too bright. I can practically see you glowing through the screen. Useless, useful, are you sure that isn't your phone? Cats and bags, how'd you know I was on a phone? Useless, useful, just a lucky guess. There, he lied. He was actually kind of running a homemade program to tell him whether signals were coming from a phone or a PC according to how strong the signal was and a few other factors. It was specifically for hacking, usually. It just also happened to pick up that the messages were coming from a phone. He just hadn't fixed that yet. He sighed as he stared at it. Just another thing he failed at doing. He shook off those thoughts, focusing once again on the chat. Cats and bags, I'll act as if I believe you. SL33 PIS 34K. What else would it be? Cats and bags, that is the million-dollar question. Izuku groaned. He didn't need this right now. He closed the chat, making a note to come back to it later as he spun his chair around. He groaned as it went a bit too quickly, bringing him a dizzy, sick feeling that came with eating too much after not having eaten, then agitating his stomach like that. He swallowed bile as he stood, walking over to his notebooks and beginning to write. He had written down everything he knew about everyone in the chats in this notebook, their quirks, the drawbacks of them. He had written down as much as he could. He had done mostly his typical analysis, just without any visual input. He wrote through the night, only stopping to listen to his mother leave at some odd hour in the morning. He had long since gotten rid of any clocks that weren't in an electronic device from his room. They just felt like they were mocking him, reminding him that he didn't have enough time in a day. Only 24 hours in a day. Only 365 days to a year, and who knows when he could die. Izuku took a deep breath. He couldn't think about that. He shouldn't think about that. He stood up to prepare for the exams. He would eat breakfast, shower, and drink something. He nodded, affirming his plans. He walked out of his bedroom to get breakfast started. He once again microwaved some leftovers. He went to the bathroom to shower. He hummed as he glanced at the few scars he had on his body. They were left by bullies. He didn't mind them that much. They didn't hurt, and he had deserved it. He ignored Useless as it complained about itself. He listened but ultimately ignored it. Useless was supposed to be ignored. He hummed as he washed his hair out, thinking about a few different songs to himself. He washed thoroughly before stepping out and drying himself off. He dried out his hair completely because if he didn't it would never dry by itself. He had once tried to brush his hair, but it refused to tame itself and never seemed to tangle. It was just fluffy. He sighed as he patted his curls, thanking them inwardly for not tangling. It would be a nightmare if the bush on top of his head was tangled as well. Izuku quickly ran the towel over the rest of him, not caring if it dried or not. He threw on some clothes that he hoped would keep him unnoticeable. If Bakugo, he had to remember to call him that. If Bakugo was going to be there, he needed to keep himself from being noticed. He decided to get a face mask. He slipped it on over his mouth as he pulled the hood of his hoodie up. He probably looked like a delinquent, but that didn't matter to him. He quickly left the house, forgetting to drink. And the food sitting in the microwave, warm but cooling. Izuku was never good at remembering Useless. Izuku hummed to himself as he walked down the road, a notebook tucked in a special pocket for it in his hoodie. He had this special pocket in all his hoodies so he could take out his notebooks in seconds to write down information. He had been making random items with scraps for years, tinkering with things and making them. His mother had no idea about anything he did. She knew about the hacking, but that was called programming. She didn't know about the support equipment or how detailed and almost scary the analyses had gotten. She didn't know because he didn't say so or show her. She didn't need to worry about him childishly clinging to a dream. It would only bring her down. She only knew that he had applied for UA and signed the forms, thinking he was just testing for general ed. But he was still at least trying for the hero course. He sighed as he reached the school. He was early by a few minutes. He walked in and walked to the exam area, sitting in a seat in the back, by an exit, in case he stopped himself again. In case Bakugo recognized him and decided he didn't care about a pro hero seeing him attempt to attack his classmate. He sighed as he shifted, leaning forward into one hand, which was propped up on the edge of the desk, one finger pinning his top lip to his bottom so he wouldn't mumble. He began to write in his notebook, absent-mindedly chewing on his bottom lip. When Hisashi walked into the large room he usually made the explanation of the practical exam in, he almost didn't notice the boy sitting right next to the entrance. He paused for a second, looking at the boy. He had a sketch of a hero in his notebook, but Hisashi, for the life of him, couldn't understand what was written. It was probably in code. But why in the world would anyone willingly write in code for a whole notebook? It was either dangerous information or embarrassing information. Hisashi felt his concern spike as the boy continued to chew his lip. He was writing rather quickly for someone writing in code. Did this kid seriously have this code memorized so well he could write it without problem? Hisashi sighed, knowing that Nezu was probably watching. He also knew Nezu was probably quite interested in getting his hands, or paws, on the youth before him. He looked around the room. There was no one else there yet. The echo of Hisashi's boots hitting the stairs as he headed down them to the stage almost felt ominous, mixed with the scratching of writing and drawing. It echoed around the empty room, but the boy seemed completely absorbed by the words he was pouring onto the page. Hisashi cleared his throat as he stood up at the stage. The boy seemed to ignore him. Hisashi frowned but decided not to break his concentration for now. He set the speech on the podium and walked off the stage so he'd have a chance at a dramatic entrance. He watched from behind the curtains as the younger brother of Ingenium walked into the room. He seemed to do a double take at the other's notebook and reached to touch the kid. The kid flinched back, falling backward in his chair. However, the kid falling didn't attract the pro hero, no. It was that the kid had made that notebook disappear so quickly one might think he had a teleportation quirk. But Hisashi managed to see him tuck it away into the inside of his hoodie. Ingenium's brother seemed to apologize and then announced your. Ingenium's brother paused. Ingenium's brother pursed his lips in consideration, before taking out his phone and opening it to something. He showed it to the other kid, whose hood had fallen to reveal springy green curls that almost looked black in the low light. The kid turned bright red at whatever was on the screen, not having moved to get up yet, thus limiting Hisashi's view of what he said, but he heard it instead. Yeah, geez, I can't believe I got found out so quick. As the kid stood up his cheeks were puffed out and he was pouting a bit, which honestly might have looked a bit adorable and a bit like a disgruntled cat, which he was sure that Shoto would appreciate. It's only because of your notebooks. You always say how much more time they take to write rather than how much time they take to translate for us, Tenya's younger brother said with a smile. The shorter kid sighed, messing with his hair. Somehow it came out fluffier than it was before. Hisashi wondered whether it had some indefinite fluffing factor. But that was a theory to test out when he saw the kid in class. If he saw the kid in class, he couldn't get attached before the kid even did anything other than sitting around in an empty auditorium writing. The greenette spoke. As I said, I'd be more than happy to talk to you. The greenette said with a smile that Hisashi swore could blind people. The brother of Ingenium, for who he still didn't have a name even if he was in this very auditorium to take the UA exams, smiled. What's your name? He asked. I'm Ida Tenya. The boy made as if to explain his bloodline, but the greenette seemed to light up as if he wasn't already the brightest thing in the room. Well, that's why your username is like that. Oh my gosh, I totally thought you were just some impersonator using part of his name like that. I was so surprised to see the resemblance, and, I was suspicious from the second you stepped in. But I didn't just want to outright call you out on it. And the greenette screeched to a halt, slamming his hands over his mouth, lights dimming to a blackout. They turned back on a second later as he smiled. I'm sorry. That was so rude. You were obviously gonna say something and I just went off on such a tangent. The kid said with a million-watt smile. And if Hisashi wasn't a pro hero he probably would have bought that it was just nothing. But something was off with the kid. Ada seemed to accept this as he nodded. I can understand. It is sometimes hard to explain things without proper context. He said, what would your name be? He questioned with a relaxed smile. Oh, my name is Izuku Midoriya, he said, stuttering halfway through his sentence. But it was more like his mouth had gone way too quick for his brain and he had to stop himself from saying something. Can you not tell anyone about that, he said, pointing at the other's phone. Hisashi made a mental note to ask Shoto about this later. He now just had to know. He was more than a bit nosy. It might be part of what made him such a good hero. Sticking his nose in business he had no reason to stick it in. Ada nods. Of course. I'll not tell anyone, but I'm almost certain most of them will figure it out eventually, Ada said, seeming to pause for a second, before patting the shorter kid's head. The shorter kid squawked in protest and ducked his head. Hey, you're supposed to be the mature one, the kid protested, laughing as he pulled his hood up, tucking away the green curls yet again. He righted his chair and sat down. forcing Ida to sit down in front of him if he wanted to continue his conversation and not put Izuku in quite an awkward position. The kids began to discuss heroes, and the Greenette seemed to be so good at analysis it was kind of scary. He ripped apart a few of the lower heroes and even completely tore apart the number 2 hero. He seemed to like All Might but was also critical of the amount of damage the other hero does on occasion. Though, he did praise the hero's control over his quirk most of the time. They discussed a few underground heroes. Ingenium's younger brother seemed a bit miffed about some of the opinions Izuku had but also was very accepting of the smaller kid. They interacted as if they had been friends for a while. It was almost smile-worthy. Almost, again, couldn't get too attached before the tests. Meanwhile, Izuku was quite enjoying the conversation with Ida. He had been so worried when Present Mike walked in and had purposefully avoided mentioning the hero when he was talking with Ida. Who knows how much the other could hear, and he didn't want to embarrass himself in front of a pro hero. Izuku fell silent as people began to fill in, putting his head down on the desk for now. Everyone seemed to look at him as they walked in. Maybe he shouldn't have sat so near to the entrance, but Ida didn't say anything about him laying his head down. Soon enough everyone was there, and the hero began to explain. As Izuku listened he had one question in mind. When Ida asked the question that was burning in his mind he almost sighed in relief. He listened to the hero's explanation. But it didn't make any sense. To have a 0-pointer would imply that there would be villains that fight you that are 0 points, which Izuku could technically classify as unbeatable, don't approach at any cost, and if by some miracle you bring him in you are elevated to god status and are then thrust at any seemingly unbeatable force until we eventually kill you. And if he was honest, that wouldn't even be a 0-pointer. Technically that would be a high point thing. Having a 0-pointer be something like civilians would have made sense, but having it be another thing that attacked them didn't make any sense at all. He tried to decipher what this meant, devolving into mumbles that made Ida turn around. Ida Tenya wasn't someone who made friends easily. He was too uptight. He followed rules strictly and religiously. So when he was the first one to figure out who useful was, he was delighted. He would get the chance to figure out the enigma that was discussed in a completely separate group chat. However, he was also quick to realize this enigma felt like a 1,000-piece puzzle with no guide and no picture. So, when Ida Tenya turned around, it wasn't to scold the shorter boy for mumbling but to listen to what the kid said. He was amazed. The kid was so smart, but looking at the group chat hadn't given him any doubts. However, seeing him work in real time was like watching a well-oiled machine achieve the impossible. He was mumbling about point totals and the logic of having a 0-pointer villain, comparing it to a real-life situation. Though, the way Izuku described what would happen to someone who beat a villain like that made Ida's heart drop to his feet. He also couldn't help but just listen to Izuku come up with plan after plan, before breaking them down and rebuilding them. Then the spell was broken as silence fell. Izuku noticed the silence and immediately put a hand over his mouth, eyes focusing on something over Ida's shoulder. Ida turned his head, alarmed to notice a pair of red eyes focused on Izuku with intent to hurt. The kid looked like he just wanted Izuku to hurt. Izuku stared at Bakugo's red eyes, feeling like his body wanted to lock up. However, instead, he migrated with everyone else to the exit in his testing area. Izuku felt his brain slowly start functioning in the testing area as Ida asked him about whether or not he was okay, worrying over him and asking him about who Bakugo was. Izuku didn't explain, only waited for the man to say go. When Izuku listened, all he heard was go, and so he went. He let whatever Present Mike said next fade into the background as he tried to figure out what he could use as a weapon. As the robots destroyed the surrounding buildings, he found a spare piece of rebar. It wasn't large and was quite light. He bounced it in his hand once or twice before beginning. The teachers watched through the cameras as the students all fought the robots. Hazashi kept an eye on Izuku Midoriya. Midoriya performed rather admirably, especially for someone who didn't use a quirk. He didn't seem to be focused on taking down the robots, and the rebar he was using was rather ineffective against the villains. Hazashi sat forward, curious as to why Izuku hadn't used his quirk yet. Hazashi watched as Izuku stopped multiple people from fighting when they got in too bad of a state. Izuku would lead them to a blind spot and then they'd both emerge. One would be bandaged, and Izuku would run off to help the next person. Izuku had no points, none at all. Hazashi groaned as he rubbed his face, moving his sunglasses to do so. Hazashi hummed as he noticed Izuku stopping for a longer time with one of the examinees, someone with light purple hair that defied gravity. They spent a long time outside of the view of the cameras. Hazashi frowned, wondering how Izuku knew about the blind spots in the cameras. Afterward, Izuku pulled the purple kid out of the blind spot, gave him a couple of thumbs up and a blinding smile, and ran off. A few minutes later, Hazashi glanced at Nezu as he chuckled. Hazashi bit his lip as he watched Nezu press the button to release the 0-pointer. Most of the students fled the path of the giant robot, with Izuku climbing on top of some rubble and looking over everyone. He stood tall as he surveyed everyone fleeing. Izuku looked over at a piece of rubble that a girl was trapped under before looking around. Izuku ran over to Ida, talking to him too quietly for the cameras to pick up. Izuku nodded a bit and handed his weapon to Ida. Izuku then quickly pointed at a building that was almost level with the zero-pointer's neck, before running off to find someone else. Izuku grabbed the purple-haired kid and asked him something. The purple-haired kid stared at him, narrowing his eyes. He nodded after a second and Izuku dragged him towards another person. The purple-haired kid asked something, and when the person answered, the purple-haired kid cut them off. The person walked over to the girl, who is still trapped under the rubble. They had a strength quirk because they lifted the rubble, and the purple-haired kid and Izuku helped pull her out from underneath. Izuku looked around before asking the purple-haired kid something. The purple-haired kid nodded, talking to the other kid, who picked up the girl and carried her to a blind spot with Izuku bouncing behind him. While this was going on, Ida had climbed up to the top of the building. Ida swallowed a bit as he gripped the rebar. He shifted, getting in position to jump on as the zero-pointer passed, focused on Izuku's group. Ida jumped, holding the rebar tightly. He landed on its shoulder with a grunt, gritting his teeth as he set the rebar against the bottom of its head like Izuku had instructed him to. He quickly jammed the rebar upwards, letting go as quickly as possible as the rebar lit up with electricity. Ida ran and jumped off, landing on the building roughly. Hasashi hummed as he watched this rescue operation. Izuku stepped out of the blind spot, leaving the person he saved and the two who helped him still in the blind spot. He held up a finger behind him before turning and running towards the building Ida was on as the zero-pointer collapsed. Izuku cupped his hands around his face as he yelled something, but for some reason it only came out as static, even though they were so close to the zero-pointer. Hasashi realized that the mic system of the zero-pointer had been destroyed and narrowed his eyes at Izuku. Izuku laughed and smiled as Ida appeared over the side of the building. He yelled something again, and Ida shook his head. Izuku said something, pointing to where he had been. Ida nodded, and within a few minutes, he was down and next to Izuku, and together they headed back to the blind spot. There was no time left, and the test was done. Izuku would probably get some credit for that whole rescue operation, but not as much as he should. He also probably wouldn't get much for the rest of the times he helped the other students, because he rarely actually saved them, and just stepped in when they weren't fighting to patch them up. Izuku left before anyone could confront him, waving to the group of people he left in the blind spot. Izuku then ran out of the school. Hasashi hummed, staying around even as the other teachers left. Shota stuck around as well because he was curious about why Hasashi was staying. Minutes later, the girl that the group had saved walked out. Hasashi's eyes narrowed, knowing she shouldn't have been able to walk that well so quickly. Ida walked beside her, with the purple-haired boy following. The girl turned around, thanking the boy. The boy waved it off and said something about Izuku, and the girl looked around. The girl asked Ida something. Ida laughed and nodded. The purple-haired boy seemed much more interested in the conversation suddenly. Shota also seemed to be invested in the conversation. Hasashi hummed, "How weird. It seems that something of interest managed to slip by Nezu," Hasashi said after a second. He stood and left the room, Shota deciding to stay for a while. Izuku was honestly exhausted after the test, but he knew that wasn't from quirk overusage. He honestly hadn't overused his quirk yet. It was because he had forgotten to eat and had been so active. He almost wished he ate more so he could have been able to help carry the girl. Almost, but if he was honest, it wouldn't be worth it. It wasn't like he'd need to do it anymore. Izuku hummed as he went to the cafeteria to get food. He dodged heroes well, teachers, but for his purposes they were obstacles. He didn't want to drag any attention to him. He honestly couldn't bring attention to him right now. He wasn't going to become a hero. He had gained no points during that whole thing, and still had no idea what the zero-pointer was meant to do. Izuku distractedly walked over to an empty table and sat down to eat. He heard the sound of more people sitting down and quickly looking up at who had sat down with him. Ochako, Hitoshi, and Ida were all looking at him expectantly. Izuku groaned. "You all figured it out, didn't you?" he asked, wanting to slam his head against the table. Ochako giggled. "Well, when you were revealed to have a healing quirk in the group chat, and then said you'd be participating in the exam even if you knew you'd fail, and watching you perform. Yeah, it was kinda easy to guess. I'm CG girl," she said, smiling excitedly. "I'm honestly kinda disappointed that you won't be in the class, but I probably won't be either. I'm sleepy's weak," Hitoshi said, smiling lazily. "Though, you seem to think sleep is non-existent if your appearance is anything to go by. Is it that obvious?" Izuku asked, alarmed as he tried to figure out whether he had forgotten anything in his usual daily routine. All three of them stared at Izuku as he went over his appearance, patted himself down, and then checked his phone. "Oh, I guess I forgot that," he said casually, before turning off his phone. "It should be fine when I get home." He looked at the other three occupants of the table, who were all silently looking at him. Hitoshi was the first to shake it off anyway. How many points did you get? He asked. The others began to talk about the test and other things as Izuku awkwardly ate his food, listening to the conversations in silence. Hitoshi frowned, looking at Izuku. You got points, didn't you? Izuku looked away awkwardly. I'm not strong enough to hurt the robots, he said casually. Ito lifted an eyebrow. Does that mean you didn't train? He questioned casually. Izuku shook his head. No, of course, I trained. It's just… Izuku sighed, before moving and pulling his sleeve up. It revealed how skinny his arms were, almost disturbingly so. Ada looked at Izuku's arms, alarmed. How much do you eat at home? Ada asked, feeling a bit faint at the idea of being that thin. Oh, enough to live, Izuku said casually, continuing to eat. The other 3 teenagers looked at each other, silently deciding that something needed to be done about Izuku's behavior. Izuku, oblivious to this all, hummed as he ate, eating enough that he would be able to keep going for the day. After he was done, he began to stand, but Hitoshi stopped him, calling out to him. As Izuku began to answer, he felt an odd sort of calm wash over him. When Hitoshi told him to sit down and eat, he felt that it was a wonderful idea, and sat down and finished his food. Hitoshi released him after he finished his food, closing his eyes in preparation for being told off. Izuku took a second to recover, before smiling and looking at Hitoshi. One could swear there were stars in his eyes. Oh my god, that's such a cool feeling. It's like everything will be okay. And then your voice says something, and that sounds like such a good idea that I just can't help but do it. That's such an interesting quirk. I was always so curious as to what you could do, but that's completely different from what I thought it would be, Izuku said excitedly, mumbling as he took his notebook from seemingly nowhere. He began to write in it, pushing his now empty tray away from himself. Ada smiled a bit, kind of relieved to see this Izuku back. Everyone else finished their food with little problems, chatting every so often, and providing Izuku with info on their quirk. Izuku excitedly questioned them and mumbled about quirk usage until it was time to go take the written portion of the test. After the written portion, they were all a little tired, but Izuku seemed energized and asked questions about the test. Afterward, they were released to go home and Izuku ran ahead, waving to them before disappearing down an alleyway. Shinso sighed as he watched Izuku disappear. All who are concerned, he asked simply. Not even having to look to see, both Ochako and Tenya agreed with him. Shinso sighed as he looked at them. Do you seriously think he's not gonna get in? He questioned, looking at the 2 other teens. Tenya sighed. We can't control the school's decision, but if he doesn't get in, we can help him get in, Tenya said, looking away as he considered this. Shinso nodded, looking away from the 2. He's getting in no matter what, Ochako agreed. Meanwhile, Izuku hummed as he headed home, unaware of the plotting of his 3 not-quite classmates. It was weeks later that an underground hero was quite badly beat within an alleyway. He watched as a cat emerged from the end of the alleyway, pausing as it saw him. It had white and black fur that was quite long. Their tails swayed as they walked over and sniffed him, probably trying to tell what was wrong. They seemed to stare at him for a while before turning and bounding away when he reached to pet it. Shota sighed as he watched the cat bound away. He wondered whether Celeste Useful knew where the cat was. He wondered whether Dusk was going to fetch her guardian. He didn't have to wonder for long, as Dusk soon came trotting back in with a green-haired teen following not too far behind. The teen looked at Shota and just stared for a second. The teen smiled, looking down at Dusk. Thank you, Dusk, he said, crouching down and taking out a tuna can. He placed it on the ground near Dusk before approaching Shota. Shota shifted, wincing a bit at the pain that lanced through his ribs. The teen merely began to take a medkit out of his bag. He opened it and began to take out a few things. Shota was soon too focused on answering rapid-fire questions to pay much attention to what the kid was doing. It felt like the pain was disappearing, but that might also be the painkillers the kid had given him. The kid kept a hand on him, maintaining skin contact. When Shota tried to put his hand away, the kid said something about it being better for him to have the contact to ground him. Shota knew whatever was said was complete BS, but didn't call him out on it for now. After the kid finished, the kid stood, looking at Dusk to check that she was done eating. He grabbed the can, pet Dusk, and then ran. Dusk stayed behind for a second, turning her head to look at Shota. She mewed, before running off. It would be almost half an hour later when Shota realized that his wounds were healed completely. Shota nearly panicked, as the kid had used his quirk on him without his knowledge. Heaven knows what the drawbacks are. However, Shota couldn't really focus on that because he knew that he hadn't had any drawbacks yet. He tried to recall the kid, but exact recollection slipped his mind. He pulled out his phone. Cats and bags. You said you have a healing quirk the other day. Or were you asking for a friend? Celeste Useful? For a friend. Cats and bags. You are a terrible liar. Shota groaned but was relieved that it was Use. He watched future students chat about their scores. Use was silent, as they usually were when certain things came up. Shota sighed as he leaned back in his chair. He pursed his lips together. Meanwhile, Izuku was beating himself over basically committing vigilantism in front of a known hero. After a few minutes of getting over that, he quickly set to work putting together an outfit to hide his identity. It wasn't too many days later that he had two things. One was a polite and graceful rejection from the hero course. If he didn't know that he had already helped a lot of people, then he might have taken the fact that All Might was the one who rejected him from the hero course 10 times worse. However, Izuku also now had a lot of allies, even if he wasn't aware of at least half of them. He mostly wandered the alleyways, helping people he came across, and Dusk every so often led them to him. When Izuku got rejected by the hero course, he focused on his vigilantism. He began improving himself, working on his clothing. He got some metal from the beach and various other things to improve his new outfit. He didn't go for anything fashionable, something he could reinforce, something that he could change to hide easily, something simple but recognizable. He ran into the young adult villain a few more times and got his name. He called him Shigaraki now, though Izuku still avoided telling him his name or any personal information. However, he did begin bringing more people for Izuku to heal. Izuku was relaxing in an alleyway, humming as he munched on an apple he had grabbed before leaving his house. With how often he had been out and about, he got hungry more often. He looked up as he heard him now, humming in acknowledgement as he set the apple aside. He shifted as he stood, looking at the person who had been brought to him. They had their hair pulled into a ponytail, many weapons, and a mask. They had a wound on their side that was probably caused by the use of a fire quirk. Izuku hummed as he pulled his mask up. "You seem like you got yourself into a bit of trouble," Izuku said companionably. "So this is what everyone meant when they said to follow the cat if you're hurt," the man said, instead of answering Izuku. Izuku nodded a bit, indicating the man should sit down. Izuku's outfit was mostly black. A black hoodie, a black mask with a white plus on it, a black beanie with a white plus on it, blue jeans, and black combat boots. "Sit down, go ahead and tell me about anything. Normally I'd ask about your quirk, but you seem a lot more uptight," he said casually. The man looked at Izuku as if judging him. After a minute the man nodded and sat down. Izuku hummed, gently taking his hand. "Now we just sit here and chat. I'm just a healer, and it'll take longer because I know basically nothing about you." The man hummed. "What are your ideals, healer?" he asked, casually as he stared at the hand where they were making contact. Izuku smiled behind his mask, his eyes sparkling. "Oh, I just want to help everyone. I mean, most people. I think certain things take it too far. Murder is kind of really bad. I don't know what I'd do if I ended up helping a murderer." Izuku laughed. The man stared at Izuku through the mask. Izuku kept talking, humming. "It seems that for once I'll be the one to talk more, I guess. Anyway, just keep calling me healer. Just last week I got my rejection from the nearby hero school. You know, it really sucked. Like, really bad. And, like, my favorite hero All Might was even the one recorded for it. I'm pretty sure he commented on me being quirkless in heroes, but I am pretty numb to that already. And, like, I actually have a quirk, so I can help people now." Izuku babbled excitedly, glancing up at the man with stars in his eyes, excitedly smiling. "And then, like, I already help people. I'm helping you now, and I'll keep helping the people that Dusk brings to me," he said honestly as Dusk's tail swished. "And, I mean, technically I'm a vigilante, but it doesn't really matter to me, as long as I can help people. The hero's license is mostly stupid anyway. Someone can get arrested for stupid things like unconsciously using their quirk, and, like, a lot of people use their quirk for daily stuff, such as a strength quirk using their quirk to lift things. But because they aren't always obvious, they wouldn't get in trouble. However, someone using their fire quirk to light their way on a night could totally get arrested." He continued to talk. "And heroes aren't always responsible with their quirks. Endeavor is terrible at it. All Might has had a few slip-ups before. All Might has a better track record, though, and his control is admirable. But Endeavor, he's so destructive. I'd be scared to have him in my neighborhood. And that's not what heroes are supposed to do. You're supposed to feel more secure with a hero in your neighborhood." He hummed as he switched hands to put that hand over his mouth. "The UA entrance exams are such bullshit, though. Mental quirks have almost no chance of getting in. And they're so great for hero work. Like, can you imagine someone with an empathy quirk as a hero? Or someone with, like, a brainwashing quirk? I've been trying to keep my quirk a secret because I know almost nothing about it," he said, checking the wound and making sure none of the cloth that was around it was healing into it. "But now if I register it, I'm gonna be connected to my vigilante persona. And, like, they'll try to arrest me. No one expects quirkless useless to be able to do anything, so it's easier." He hums as he puts the hand back on the stranger's. "My quirk. Geez, it's so weird to realize I have a quirk. But it's kinda useless. I mean, other than for this. In the few times I've had to fight, it's been so hard. I just feel lucky that I can create support gear. Maybe I should have tried for the support class." He mumbles slightly but apparently, I did really well in my written test. I was ecstatic about that. Apparently, the principal might want to chat with me, but I don't think I could handle that. Stendhal silently stared at the teenager before him. Stendhal had been quite relieved to see the cat, after having heard stories about it from other vigilantes and villains. When he found that the person who helped the others was a teen, he had been a bit uneasy. Stendhal listened in silence to the others rambling, feeling offended for the kid. He could feel the healing quirk working, and just listened to the kid talk. He honestly felt the kid would make a great hero, but the kid seemed rather resigned to his lot in life. Stendhal shifted, keeping his hand between the kid's hands. The kid seemed to have forgotten about his presence, as he was now just mumbling to himself, so much so that Stendhal didn't even understand what he was saying. Stendhal thought about the kid's answer to his question. He just wanted to help. Stendhal hummed. He could see how that might be considered a bad thing to some heroes. But the point of putting people in prisons was multifaceted. They were supposed to be contained, but they were also supposed to reform. Stendhal hummed, wondering whether the kid might be able to help people like that. Helping villains reform would be a very noble profession, though Stendhal could see how some might abuse that position. He knew the kid's conviction and knew the kid wouldn't use it in that way. And judging by the kid's appearance, the kid already didn't use the resources they had to take care of themselves. So if they did reform villains, they would probably be oblivious to the fact that they'd have so many people dedicated to them. Hell, the kid was probably oblivious to the fact that some of the more dangerous villains had already been warned off of harming him. Izuku hummed as he looked at the wound and saw it healed. He removed his hands. All done. You can go do whatever it is you do. I'll be here for the night if you need help, he said excitedly, smiling brightly and waving. The man sighed as he stood. You're a good kid. You'll be a great hero when you finally decide they are worthy of you, he said, and before Izuku could question what he meant, the man was gone. Izuku hummed at the man's words and looked at Dusk. He seems nice to think useless could do anything, Izuku said to Dusk, opening a can of cat food and giving it to Dusk. He pets her gently as he stared out into the darkness. Izuku was more than a bit surprised when Tamura was led into the alleyway where he was working by Dusk. He had a few different gunshot wounds. Izuku hummed as he walked over and placed a hand on Tamura's arm. Tamura sighed as he watched Izuku work. Izuku smiled at Tamura from behind his mask. You seem like you got yourself into a bit of trouble, player. Izuku jokes, laughing a bit. Tamura rolled his eyes. Yeah, whatever, healer. It's what I have you for, he said casually, smiling a bit. The quirk healed Tamura quickly, and soon enough the young adult stretched. Anyway, kid, I was surprised to hear that you're just healing anyone who your cat leads to you. What happens if someone's a creep or stabs you? He questioned casually. Izuku hummed, considering it as he looked at Tamura. I never really thought about it. It doesn't really matter to me, he admitted as he turned away to pet Dusk. Tamura didn't speak for a second before questioning it. Doesn't matter to you if you get stabbed? Tamura questioned, like, because you can heal yourself or? Izuku laughed, shaking his head. Oh, no. I can't heal myself at all. I don't know why. And it's rather odd for a healing quirk, but it doesn't matter to me, he said honestly, laughing still. Izuku didn't see, but Tamura was staring at him. Izuku hummed as he pet Dusk. Listen, kid. You can't be serious, right? Are you sure you're okay? He questioned, reaching forward with the gloves Izuku had gotten for him. They covered a few of his fingers to prevent him from disintegrating things. Izuku had gotten them after hearing him complain about disintegrating controllers. Izuku laughed. Oh, yeah, I'm fine. There's no need to worry about me, Izuku said, looking back at Tamura with a smile that no one could see underneath his mask. It didn't reach his eyes. Tamura stopped for a bit, knowing he wouldn't be able to get through to Izuku. He wasn't even sure how to get through to Izuku. Tamura pulled his hand back, beginning to scratch at his neck. Izuku quickly stood and grabbed his hand. He pulled it away from his neck. I just healed that, Izuku scolded with a smile, the stars returning to his eyes as he smiled up at Tamura. Tamura didn't know what to say, staring at him. Izuku let go and began to leave the alleyway anyway. I'm pretty sure everything's fine, and I don't think there are too many other people I'll need to heal tonight, but I need to check. See you later, he said, before turning a corner and running off. Tamura sighed after watching Izuku run around the corner. He looked at Dusk. Have you been taking care of him? He asked the cat, for no real reason, but just because he felt the need to make sure someone was looking out for the healer. Tamura hummed at that idea, before nodding. He quickly left the alleyway, getting a decent distance before texting his location to Kurogiri. He stepped through the portal and into a bar. It would be later that Izuku hears about the sports festival. He politely drops out, causing a lot of stares from various students who wanted to get into the hero course. He knew that all of his friends got into the hero course, and that was fine with him. On a walk through the hallways, he hears the commotion at Class 1 and decides to investigate. Though he stays to the side and hidden from Bakugo's view, he listens to the conversation, before deciding that it might be good to talk to Monoma. Maybe he can talk him down from his always angry at Class 1 estate. He didn't think he could handle two Bakugas. Izuku was avoidant. At school, the work didn't challenge him, and he completed it quickly and quietly. He was quick to slip out of view whenever someone tried to find him, and often skipped going to the cafeteria and found other, quiet places to eat if he ate. Most of the time he ate, but sometimes he was too busy texting or doing something else. He wondered whether the teachers noticed, sometimes. However, he didn't bother to ask or point out anything. He heard the news talking about a vigilante called the Healer every so often but didn't think anything of it. They were just more background noise, a sort of reminder that Useless couldn't be a hero. Izuku shook his head out of those thoughts, focusing on the current predicament. He stayed quiet as he waited for Bakugo and the rest of class wanted to leave. He soon left his hiding spot and quickly retreated from the school. As he left the school, he retrieved his vigilante mask out of his pocket. Izuku spent more and more time healing people. It was nice to heal people and know he was helping. He healed villains and heroes. Only the lower heroes seemed to come to him, which he didn't mind. Occasionally a small confrontation would happen when both a hero and a villain tried to come at the same time. And usually, Izuku would have to intervene and establish that it was neutral. Normally, establishing that it was neutral meant that he would restrain the hero, to heal the villain and let them run off, then heal the hero and let them run off. He didn't care what happened as long as it wasn't near him in dusk. Despite his lack of participation, he went to the sports festival and took notes. He watched the number 2 hero arrive and decided to follow. He was given clearance as a student, and also said he was friends of certain people. When number 2 started looking for his son and saying things about him, Izuku couldn't stand it. Hearing someone else objectified like that made him feel sick. While Useless shouldn't be able to do anything, Useless didn't care. Izuku marched over and stood in front of Endeavor and glared. "You should leave your son alone. He needs time to calm himself so he can focus on the tournament. Having a father that lords over him isn't gonna help. Though, I would say that the number 2 hero isn't any stranger to throwing his weight around. Luckily, I have something that lets me throw my own weight around. Isn't that wonderful?" I noticed Mr. Endeavor wandered around places he shouldn't. I also noticed Mr. Endeavor's household seems to be burning at 2 ends. I think you might want to be very careful because pitfalls are very useful against people like you. The ground drops out from under you and suddenly, you're falling. Izuku smiled with a small giggle. Though your masterpiece is doing rather well, I would say that it doesn't matter because he's not yours. His name is Shoto Todoroki. He is your son, and he chooses what he wants to do. I would advise you to remember this well because security cameras are quite useful, especially when you're so confident you forget about the ones across the street. Izuku then booked it in the way of bouncing down the hallway. As he passed the Todoroki kid, he grabbed his arm. Izuku dragged him down the hallway to a more private area. Your father shouldn't bother you right now. He should be processing the fact that I wasn't overly hidden with my threats, and wondering what pitfalls I was talking about. Izuku smiled at Todoroki and it was blinding. Anyway, I noticed you're uncomfortable with half your quirk. When Todoroki went to say something and Izuku cut him off. And I'm not saying you should use it. I am saying that you are your own person. Your father may say you're his masterpiece, but you're your own person. He doesn't own you. His only claim over you is sperm donor, and from there you are your own person. I don't care what your past is, but, the camera across the street from your house has a good view of the open window. I don't know what's up with him, and if you ever need help. He moved, taking out his notebook, writing his number. He tore out the page and gave it to Todoroki before taking off. He went to intercept someone from going to Recovery Girl, and instead healing them himself, sliding on his mask so he wouldn't be recognized too quickly. He hummed as he quickly left the festival area. He was excited after seeing all those cool quirks on display. He had pulled Monoma aside and chatted about their quirk while healing a few bruises. He had honestly told Monoma about his quirk to warn him off of trying to steal it to use in the competition, admitting that he couldn't heal himself with it, so he wasn't sure whether it would help Monoma. Monoma seemed rather friendly if you weren't in Class 1A, and Izuku had a decent chat with him, joking around a bit and enjoying his company. Afterward, he had simply asked Monoma to at least try to be friendly with Wona since he knew from experience Kachin was a bit mean. Izuku frowned at the mess up. He shook his head and walked away, walking towards an alleyway as he slipped his beanie on. Izuku believed no one noticed Useless slipping away. However, he couldn't be more wrong. Silently, many people watched the citizen slipping away, and a smaller number of people watched the citizen become a vigilante, slinking away into the shadows they naturally resided in. The hidden parts of society often needed them the most. News about the healer continued to spread far and wide, with a few other vigilantes singing his praises, villains warding off thugs and the like from the only available healer they had, and heroes tentatively reaching towards them when they were in a time of need. The healer, however, did not just sit still. They began to set up something. It wouldn't be ready for a while longer, but it would be more transportable than their home setup. It would also allow them some type of safety when doing their work. Meanwhile, Shoto was dealing with quite a case. He had been assigned to the case of the healer, who was a vigilante that they didn't really want to detain. They knew that their healing quirk was particularly strong and were wanting to see whether they could convince the kid to completely step into the light as a hero healer. Judging from the small amount of information they could get from the few people who were willing to give information, which was honestly a scarily small group, normally they could convince more than 3 people to tell them anything. The 3 people were under very extensive protection, not from the healer, but the people surrounding them. Apparently, the healer had the League of Villains under their thumb, though according to all 3 of their sources, they were unaware of this fact. This meant that they had the future overlord of the underworld willing to protect them. And wasn't that a terrifying thought? That a simple healer who didn't even prefer villains or heroes, just healed everyone, held so much power. Who knew what would happen if that kid got arrested? It was almost guaranteed that this was a kid. An abnormally short kid, apparently. The one who had actually seen their face had looked like they had sucked on a lemon when asked for their description. They had vehemently refused, stating that the kid was exactly where he belonged. Now there were rumors of some big-shot vigilante also putting a claim over the kid, saying that he was of the good sort. He also mentioned that the world hadn't earned a hero like him yet. This was more than a bit worrying. However, now Shota was judging all the information gathered and was slowly realizing that useful. And the healer might be the same person. Shota groaned in frustration before messaging the group chat. Shota groaned, wondering whether he should just confront the kid. Clearly, something was wrong if they could get away with being up so late and attending school. On top of regularly using their quirk to heal people, Shota couldn't imagine how hard that kid was currently pushing himself. Shota shook it off as he focused on the folders. He sighed before putting a second alias next to the healer, labeling the second one useful. Hours later, Izuku hummed as he finished cleaning the dishes. He quickly left the house, grabbing his bag of supplies. He ran out the door into an alleyway, Dusk soon arriving at his side. He smiled at her. "Hello, girl. Let's go help more people," he said excitedly as he turned forward and went into the alleyway to sit down and set up. It was the dead of the night when he was surprised by an injured Eraserhead walking into his alleyway. Izuku hummed under his mask as he set about healing the man. He was relaxed, not overly concerned about the man trying anything at this moment. At one point, the question and usual conversation between him and his patients was broken by a rather odd question from Eraserhead. "When do you get any sleep? I imagine you have school and this whole vigilante business." Izuku glanced up at the hero before humming. He chuckles as he considers this question. He wonders why Useless would need sleep. Useless had things they needed to do to make up for Useless. Useless closed his eyes, taking a slow breath. Izuku opened them and answered, "I don't." He smiled as he answered honestly. Shota blinked at the kid's answer. The kid had paused for a while and he had been concerned he pushed too hard too early. The kid was probably gonna be flighty, so he couldn't scare him away now. So, when he heard the answer, he was concerned. It seemed so honest and genuine. There was no way this kid was lying. Shota frowned. "Kid, if you don't take care of yourself, you won't be able to help anyone." Shota tried, looking at the kid's eyes. The kid seemed surprised at his question, staring at him as if he had asked the kid to slingshot him to Mars. Actually, the kid probably wouldn't be looking at him this way even if he had asked that. He probably would have looked for someone like Uraraka and done exactly as Shota asked. It was almost heartbreaking to see this kid surprised at the fact that someone asked him to take care of himself. The kid muttered something, looking away as they took their hands off Shota. "It's done," they said, standing and walking over to their cat. The cat, Dusk, purred as they rubbed against the kid's hand, nuzzling it gently. The kid hummed, pulling out a can of cat food. "Kid, do you have anyone at home looking after you?" Shota questioned. The kid waved off his question, quite literally. It was but a few minutes later that fucking Tamura Shigaraki strolled into the alleyway. The young adult paused, staring at Shota. After a second he looked away, looking at Use. "Hey, healer, what's Eraserhead doing in your alleyway?" Shigaraki questioned, walking over and putting a hand on Use's shoulder. The only thing holding Shota back from attacking right then was the fact that Shigaraki had gloves on. Use rolled his eyes as Dusk jumped from her windowsill to stroll away, nose in the air. "I don't only heal villains, Shigaraki. Surely you've realized that." Use responded casually. Shota could swear he recognized that voice, despite it being muffled. Shigaraki sighed. "I wish you would. It would make everything so much easier," Shigaraki said, but a fond smile was playing upon his lips as he ruffled Use's hair. Shota felt kind of horrified seeing evidence of the kid being so friendly with a villain, but was also reminded of the fact that the League of Villains was currently one of his protectors. On top of that, the vigilante healed indiscriminately. "Whatever, Shigaraki. I gotta work on my database," the healer said as he moved to sit on a box at the end of the alleyway which had a laptop sitting near it. Shigaraki followed the kid, and Shota couldn't do anything but sit and watch. "Healer, what database are you talking about?" he questioned casually. "The one to make sure I'm not assisting cold-blooded killers. Though, I think I might have done that already." There was this really quiet and kinda creepy guy. I knew I probably wouldn't be able to get any info out of him on that visit, so I talked with him for a bit, and when he was healed he said something about me deeming Hero Society worthy of me. Or whatever. It's, like, super stupid. I don't see how he could ever think Hero Society wants me. The healer said casually as they typed away at their keyboard. Shigaraki shifted uncomfortably, and before his hands so much as twitched the healer had grabbed his pinky finger on one of them. I healed that, the healer said simply, not even glancing over at the leader of the League of Villains. Shigaraki sighed. Yes, I know, he said simply as he crossed his arm and watched the intelligent vigilante at work. How many people do you have a quirk analysis on now? The healer laughed. Oh, so many. And the healer paused, glancing at Shota. He typed something, and motions for Shigaraki to look. Shigaraki nodded a bit. The healer continued talking. But also I have them on all the villains, heroes, and vigilantes. All safe and encoded, of course. The healer was casual as they spoke about potentially life or death information. Shota couldn't help but interrupt. Wait. You have a quirk analysis of everyone who's passed you? Shota questioned, staring at the healer. Well, yeah, for the most part. Also, it's incredibly rude to interrupt a conversation. But anyway, Shigaraki, I've been hearing a lot more people talking about the healer. It's so easy to overhear conversations. The healer said, casually. I wonder who they are. They don't really have a description of them, just that they're probably high school aged with a healing quirk. Shota stared at the kid who seemed so intelligent but didn't put together that the news was talking about him. He was more than happy to keep the kid oblivious to how much the media was looking at him. However, Shigaraki obviously didn't share those sentiments. Healer, you are the healer, Shigaraki said, grabbing Yusa's arm. Yu stared up at Shigaraki, seeming to process for a second, before realizing. Oh, really? Sorry, just, not used to it. You understand, Yu said, throwing a sideways glance at Shigaraki, then looking at Shota, then back to his computer. It seemed Shigaraki knew more about the healer than Shota did. But, if the healer was Yu's, they thought they were quirkless until a few months ago. He needed to add this to the healer's file later. Izuku, meanwhile, was casually working on hacking the police station. It wasn't necessarily hacking it that was giving him problems, but giving himself a reliable backdoor that he was sure could take a beating. Soon enough Tamura and Eraser had left, and he felt like he could sigh in relief without risking Aizawa discovering his civilian identity. He really needed to brush up on his skills if he had missed the fact that he was the healer. Izuku had privately named his own quirk Doctor's Blessing. It wasn't exactly descriptive as to what it was, but he had no other way to describe it. The best-suited applicant would be a doctor, with extensive knowledge of a person's body and their medical history. A doctor would ideally be able to heal someone of their injuries effortlessly with Izuku's quirk. However, he still hadn't gotten it registered for fear of being hunted down. He had been quietly using it on the hero students. He would distract them with talking, while loosely holding onto their wrist. After he was sure they were healed, he would become the wraith he was known for being by all the general education students. All his friends who had gotten into the hero course noticed what he was doing, but didn't mention it. As long as they didn't mention it, Izuku stayed a solid being they could grasp onto. Shinsu had expressed a great amount of fear to the other two. Fear that if they tried to do anything, Izuku would turn into a shade and completely slip from any of their grasps before they could even lay a finger on him. He would pack up his unending emotional baggage and take off for the next town. Their whole group knew he could get away with it. They just feared what would happen after that, what he would do. Would they later see on the news he died of a drug overdose? Or that he had become a supervillain because Hero Society had continuously kicked him in the balls for even thinking he could attempt to claw himself a niche in the word hero? Or would they hear that he had been found starved to death because he barely ate lunch without the threat of Shinsu brainwashing him? And even then it sometimes didn't work, so no one mentioned it. The group skittered around issues, terrified to take a step, for the only reason that Izuku was solid was that he decided to be. However, if the three friends of Izuku were noticing it, then the staff all had flashing neon signs pointing to it. Students weren't going to Recovery Girl as often as they should be, and when questioned they mentioned a plain-looking boy from general education who talked to them about anything and everything, but especially quirks. Shota felt like he should be connecting the dots here, and quickly slipped into the folder for the healer general education student at UA. Shota wouldn't be able to go to the general education class without the healer probably fleeing the second they were out of sight, disappearing into the night without a trace. Shota sighed in annoyance, wondering how this general education student had so much time. Shota went to the different teachers, asking about a general studies student who was smarter than the rest, completing work early, leaving the classroom early. All the flashing signs pointed to one person, a small green-haired boy with freckles and green eyes that could give emeralds a run for their money. He was abnormally thin but surprisingly fit. His build didn't fit him, and he seemed to be in his own head. He was constantly writing, finger pressed against his lips like he was trying to keep them sealed. He was writing in a language Shota didn't understand. Shota went to Hisashi, who spilled the beans about a student who had come early to the exam, sat down, written, had admitted to keeping a book in code, had been immediately recognized by Ida and talked to. Izuku Midoriya was useful. And the healer. Izuku Midoriya was a terrifying force of nature who had coordinated the attack on the zero-pointer and healed everyone outside of camera view so that he wouldn't be recognized by his quirk. He was a force of nature who kept everyone's weaknesses neatly tucked away in a notebook. A hoarder of information who hid it away within himself, recalling it whenever he wanted to write about it. An analyzer of proportions that Yue hadn't seen in a while if his useful account was anything to go by. However, Izuku Midoriya was also completely insubstantial. He slipped away as Shota stalked the hallways, only to be spotted in the retreating heel of trademark red shoes, in the sound of feet hitting tiles as they quickly retreated from the position where Shota had been silently stalking with his capture weapon ready. He swept away students that needed to go to Recovery Girl, disappearing with them only for the student to reappear, confused as to where Izuku was, or who Izuku even was since he never really said his name. They would be healed, just lost and confused. Shota did not understand how a kid who couldn't have any more than a few months of stealth training could evade him. Then he remembered that the kid probably had more intelligence in his pinky than some people accumulated in a lifetime, and he sighed in exasperation. He had to catch the kid. He needed to ask questions, get answers. There was no way he would be able to do this while the kid was at as peak condition as he could get. Though, from the appearance of the kid, Shota honestly could say that the kid could probably do a lot better. Shota shuddered to think what the kid would be able to do when he got some self-preservation into him. If they could get the kid to finally aim at the villains, then he'd be a wonderful hero. Even if not, they'd find a way to get information. He was sure once the kid got some self-preservation, he'd be willing to trade information. However, currently, all the staff of UA was struggling to find the newly born escape artist. Or maybe this wasn't newly born, and it had just been a slumbering beast. There was a saying out there about slumbering beasts, and Shota thinks that it was made for this specific occasion. He growls slightly as he watches a red shoe disappear down a hallway which once again is empty when he finally reaches it. "When I find you," Shota sighed, gritting his teeth as he stalked away. He didn't bother to turn around when he heard the sound of a young boy scampering away and out of sight. It felt like he and the teachers were trying to chase down a ghost. Shota went to see Nezu, asking him to see where Izuku was and where he was hiding. Nezu sighed as he tried to find where his wayward student had wandered. He slowly realized that none of his cameras were showing any of the activity they were supposed to. Where people were supposed to be walking, there was no one. Where no one was supposed to be walking, there were people. Nezu paused, shifting in his seat as he tried to decide what to do. He rubbed his chin as he stared at the screens. "Well, it seems your student is quite slippery. He managed to mix up and loop footage on our cameras," Nezu said honestly as he shifted. Shota didn't know how to react, other than staring dumbfounded. "So, you're telling me that he can hack the school's cameras?" Shota said, groaning as he rubbed his forehead. Nezu merely chuckles, probably enjoying Shota's suffering. "If you asked Shota, well, if you can catch your wayward student, I would love to have a conversation with them," Nezu says with a smile. Shota nodded as he stood, leaving Nezu's office. He headed towards the exit to try and catch the student as they left, but ended up watching Izuku disappear over the wall. Shota stared as Izuku dropped off the top of the wall. He sighed a bit, knowing that catching the kid won't be easy. If he goes to the healer uninjured, they'll bolt. And that's if Dusk will even let him near the healer when he's uninjured. Izuku already proved that if he doesn't want to be found, then he won't be. Shota groaned, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He needed more coffee for this. Meanwhile, Izuku sighed in relief on the other side of the wall. It wasn't easy dodging everyone in the halls. Luckily, there were plenty of training areas that weren't in use. Most of the ones in use didn't mind him barging in under the pretense of checking it out for later. Izuku hummed as he began to walk home, keeping an eye out for if any of the teachers were trying to follow him. But it seemed only Aizawa had the idea to try and intercept him while he left. He went home to an empty house, announcing, "I'm home," with an empty smile. He hummed to himself as he went to his room and changed into his vigilante gear. He wrapped some bandages around himself. They were technically just some ace bandages, but he had reinforced them so he could use them to fight and detain people. Izuku hummed to himself, wrapping them around his hands and arms. Afterward, he went to his computer, checking the messages. Shinsu, Achako, and Ida had asked him why the teacher was looking for him. They had made a private chat since becoming friends. Useful, I can't explain that yet, guys. Secrets. SL33 PIS 34K, UBT2RTLSB4 UGTCGHT. And Jen, Shinsu, your typing is atrocious. SL33 PIS 34K, THX. ZG girl, okay, but I agree with Shinsu. And Jen, yes, and hopefully you are not doing anything harmful. Useful, living is harmful. Izuku logged off as he quickly grabbed his bag, stuffing his laptop in and leaving. Izuku went to a random alleyway and sat down, relaxing as he turned on his laptop and began again. Izuku let out a cheer as he finished. Finally, now that it was up and running, he could start helping even more. Izuku smiled at that thought, before noticing a file on a person he was rather certain he'd seen before. He opened it and paled as he realized who he had interacted with. Izuku couldn't say that he was proud of having interacted with Stendhal, who has recently become the villain Stain, hero killer. Stain was terrifying in his versatility as well as his skill with his quirk. Izuku was analyzing a few videos that street cams had managed to catch. It wasn't a lot, just a percentage of the few heroes he had killed already. He watched closely and was able to catch sight of the man licking his blade. It was a quick second, just a quick movement. The footage was dark and grainy, and for most, it would be invisible. For Izuku, however, he spotted the way Stain's head moved. He hummed as he wrote. His pencil scratched away at the paper as he drew Stain and Stendhal. He was sitting in the alleyway, in his vigilante getup. It had recently been improved, his hoodie being reinforced. He has switched out his cloth face mask for a small air filter mask with a voice changer inside. Both of these items had a white plus on them and were all black. His hoodie had been adjusted so that there was a clip on the inside and top that would clip to his mask. This was so the hoodie didn't accidentally fall while he was moving quickly. His hair could be recognized, and he would rather not get caught just from his hoodie falling. Izuku hummed as he worked, writing down everything he could find on Stain's quirk. It worked by consuming blood and seemed to paralyze the victims. The reason he knew it paralyzed the victims was that after licking his blade, Stain would come out with a blade covered in blood and unharmed. This would imply that he was able to finish them quickly and effortlessly afterward. Izuku watched through grainy footage as Stain leaped onto the rooftops and took off. Izuku had to wonder why Stain was targeting some of these heroes, so he had looked into it. Izuku quickly realized that Stain was targeting heroes that made the highest wages, donated little to charity, and did little hero work. Often these heroes were well-known, spotlight heroes who seemed not to care when they were out of the camera. Izuku hummed, trying to figure out what to do with this information. Some of these heroes had done really bad stuff in the background if Izuku's research was anything to go by, which, considering that he's useless, it might not be. Izuku looked up as he heard Dusk let out a meow. He looked at the villain that had been brought to him. He wore an interesting black and white outfit. Izuku smiled at him. Before looking at his hands, I'm gonna need you to take the gloves of your outfit off. I need direct skin contact to make my quirk work, Izuku said, shifting and offering his hands to the villain. The villain stared at him for a moment, before sighing as he stripped off his gloves. He took Izuku's hand and sat on a box that was flipped upside down specifically so the people Izuku was healing had a place to sit. Izuku hummed, "So, what's your quirk?" he asked simply as he relaxed, smiling easily at the villain, even with his face cover. Jin, now known as Twice, sighed as he began to explain his quirk. It had been a few weeks since the incident. He was still covered in bruises from it, so when he had heard of a healer that would heal you without questioning whether or not you're a villain, and even seemed to protect villains when they were close enough, he had been hoping to get the bruises healed. He had discovered the cat that everyone talked about while wandering and looking for this healer. The cat had walked right up to him and sniffed him. She had stared at him as if staring through his soul. She had then gone running off and Jin had to run to keep up. Whatever he had been expecting of the healer, it wasn't some shorty who barely reached his shoulders and looked like if he sneezed too hard he'd go flying into the wall and break all his bones. As Jin carefully held the kid's hands, he felt how thin he was. He could feel the kid's bones, which was an utterly terrifying thought. As the kid listened, he would nod at both his normal self and his other self. He listened, even as Jin contradicted himself. Afterward, the kid hummed, bringing his free hand to his masked mouth, as if to press his hand against it. However, Jin could hear the muttering, even if he could barely understand the kid. Something about measurements, clones, and quirks. He also muttered something about Jin himself, but Jin still couldn't quite make out what he was saying. "Hey, kid, speak up," he found himself saying, while also rushing to say, "Oh, no, it's fine, just, share whenever you're ready." The kid looked at him and laughed. "Sorry about that. I was just thinking about the potential for your quirk. I mean, it's an amazing quirk. One that copies both people and their quirk. Like, some of the drawbacks seem to suck a little, but you could do something like copy an animal you've seen and cause a distraction. Or, like, if your copies use your quirk. Since you can only have 2 copies at once, you can copy a person, then yourself, then copy that same person, and yourself again. And, if you keep track of all the measurements, you can copy someone whenever you want." Jin blinked at the kid's analysis of his quirk. He hadn't exactly thought of copying himself to copy someone else more than once yet. He had, of course, made multiple copies of himself. The kid continued, "And, even then, you can measure something standardized, like a dumpster, and make a copy of it whenever. Since you copy it perfectly, it's a perfect distraction to throw at enemies if you have someone with super strength on your side. Throwing heavy objects at them should have the same weight and mass since you perfectly copy it. It could stun them and the thing would probably get destroyed pretty quickly, so you can make something else. You could, technically, be a walking arsenal if you got creative with your quirk. The kid seemed excitable. Jin looked at the thin hand that was in his, then back to the kid's sparkling eyes. This kid was blindingly bright if you ignored the fact that he was probably a walking stick. That's some really smart ideas, kid, he said, honestly. The kid seemed to deflate. And damn if that didn't poke at whatever was left of Jin's conscience. Oh yeah, you've probably thought of this all before, he muttered, rubbing his arm. Jin didn't know what to say. I didn't, he stated simply, watching the kid closely. He couldn't figure out what had caused the kid to have so little confidence in himself. Oh, glad I could help. I'm pretty sure you're all healed. You got pretty banged up. I'm glad you're okay, the kid said, slipping his hand away from Jin. Jin stood the names twice. Kid, I'll see you around, he said, even as he said no it's not. And I hope I'll never see you again. The kid seems to have gotten used to his contradictions, laughed, smiling. All right, come to me next time, he said as Jin slipped on his gloves. Jin couldn't help but think that the kid was odd, especially considering the people he was surrounded with. Meanwhile, Izuku watched Twice leave his alleyway. He hummed as he looked at Dusk. Geez, he was unique. He was nice to call my ideas smart. His quirk was so cool, he said honestly, moving to look at his laptop in the police registry. Izuku leaned against the box he had set up as a table, considering. Maybe he could rent an apartment to do his vigilante work in. It would be more welcoming, but he would also have an area where he could easily be caught. Izuku sighed, slumping against the box as he reached to his bag and opened a tuna can for Dusk. A few nearby cats wandered towards where he was, having heard the can opening. Izuku placed some cat food on the ground for them, emptying cans of wet cat food onto a paper plate which he stood and set near the alleyway entrance. He went back to his seat and watched as various cats walked up to eat some. It wasn't a large amount, but more wandered over as time went on. They all wandered off after eating their fill. Izuku stared at the animals, thinking of himself and being useless. He looked at his hands as he thought about everything. He needed to do more. Maybe he could help his friends train their quirks. He should probably talk to Monoma about his quirk and everything. Monoma had seemed surprised when he had complimented it. He could do quirk analysis. He needed to make up for being useless. Izuku nodded at that thought, now set on his path. Over the next few days, Izuku began sorting papers. He bought a few manila envelopes. He labeled them with names or case numbers. He began making neater papers, though he couldn't help but write a few times about how cool certain quirks were or their versatility. He wrote about the killers and cold-blooded murderers. He felt a bit bad about writing on Stain since Stain was technically doing some good. He was getting rid of horrible heroes who didn't deserve to be called heroes at all. However, he was also killing people. Izuku drew a hard line at killing people. He couldn't do it. He couldn't let Stain continue to kill people. He desperately wanted to ask Stain what he was doing. He wanted to ask Stain whether he thought this would change things. He shook his head. He was useless. He should stick to his lane. Izuku hummed as he hacked the police cameras. He went to the police station, wearing a normal black hoodie and a face mask. He walked in, not doing much except acting like he was waiting for something. When someone went to his seat to figure out why he was sitting there, he wasn't there anymore. Instead, a manila folder was sitting there. It had various names and case numbers on it. However, one drew the attention of every person. Stain was written as one of the names. When they opened the folder, there are multiple labeled folders within. The police rushed to open the one on Stain. It had some info that they knew, and some that they didn't. They didn't realize that he had licked his blades and killed them right afterward. Now, if only they could find the person who had labeled these documents as a helper. If only to ask them whether this was true so they could have Tsukachi verify. Meanwhile, Izuku was panting from the spot he had run to. The police radio burst with activity, reports of the hacking he had done of the cameras, reports of a helper and that they need to put out a search for the person who gave them the documents. Izuku ran to Yue, ignoring the gnawing in his stomach and the dizzy feeling he got from running. He hacked the cameras and slipped inside. He hummed as he walked, looking around and beginning to memorize his surroundings. He went to class, knowing he was early, but also knowing that as long as he was there with other students then they couldn't do much. If they tried to hold him after class he'd just run. Izuku continued to dodge the teachers for today, and he dropped off an analysis at Ida's desk. He knew Ida would know who it was, but he hoped he wouldn't say anything. He had noticed that Ida was off the past couple of days, since the sports festival. He was hoping to cheer him up with the analysis. Izuku hummed as he strolled down an empty hallway, relaxing as he avoided everyone. He didn't feel like eating lunch today, despite the gnawing in his stomach. He needed to do more. He was a ravenous creature who devoured tasks like a dragon hoards gold. He had finished a lot of the quirk analysis folders, so he needed to do more. It wouldn't be until days later that people paid attention to what had happened. Nezu was the first, having noticed the detailed analysis after it had saved Ida from dying. Even if Stain had managed to escape, He had looked through the cameras but found nothing. 1 second the desk was empty, and the next the folder was there. Then it would be the police, hearing from Ada about receiving a manila folder the same day they received one, both delivered by a helper. When asked if Ada knew who had done it, Ada had answered honestly. He had openly admitted that it was probably his friend, Izuku Midoriya. He was well known on the hero forums for his detailed analysis of quirks and the fact that they were terrifyingly accurate. It was whispered about on the forum that if you had encountered him once that he knew everything about you and could probably find 100 different ways to kill you if he put his mind to it. When asked if Midoriya had known what he was going to do, he had answered honestly. He had admitted that Midoriya probably had no clue and had merely been trying to help after seeing him so down. Kenji honestly didn't know what to do about this. With the username of Izuku Midoriya connected to the vigilante the healer, technically they could try to arrest him. However, that was risky as it had already been made clear to them by Midoriya's friends that Midoriya was a self-destructive team that was more slippery than an eel, having evaded pro heroes who had years more experience. Not to mention, he wasn't taking the quirk analysis lightly. This boy probably had every policeman's quirk analyzed and knew how to counter them. However, what made it more interesting was that Midoriya seemed to have personal experience with Stain, back when Stain was Stendhal. Midoriya couldn't contain his confusion and had written on Stain's folder. It was a question about heroes and worthiness. What made someone useless like him worthy of being a hero? What Stain had meant about something. It wasn't clear enough for Kenji to make full sense of it. Kenji sighed a bit as he stared at the folders, wondering what to do about someone like this, especially since the kid probably had access to all their information as well. If the hacking and backdoor they found was anything to go by. If the kid even slightly suspected they were doing an operation to grab him, he'd probably disappear. So, Kenji went to Eraserhead, the hero who currently was dealing with the case. We have more information on the healer. Your connection to their useful username has brought Izuku Midoriya into the investigation. Izuku Midoriya is the healer and the helper from these folders. Kenji placed the folders in front of Eraserhead. We currently have information on his family and himself. He was a bit of a delinquent when he was in middle school, written up for antagonizing students and a few other things. He is quirkless, supposedly. We need to look into that. To add to it, he is extremely self-destructive. His friends say that he rarely eats, and is thin as a stick. He's honestly lucky he's so good at split-second analysis, or he probably would have been brought in a lot quicker. Eraserhead sighed, leaning against the wall. He leaned his head back, looking up. I knew he had it bad, but wow, this is so much worse than I thought. We're stuck until he screws up or comes to us. Both the principal and I don't want him in jail. He'd honestly do so good as a hero healer, or even an informant. Kenji couldn't help but nod in agreement. They sure as hell didn't want skills like that completely on the villain's side. If they put him in jail, he'd get out rather quickly, because he was a kid. And, anyway, the public had kind of become endeared to the soft-hearted vigilante after more than a few heroes had taken pictures of the kid and his cat. There were also pictures of him feeding the wild cat population and helping various people. A lot of people came out with stories of him healing them. However, no one was willing to give them any actual info on him. Some had even admitted to seeing his face. This case would be practically impossible without even a small amount of cooperation from the healer. So they were back at square one. How to get Izuku Midoriya into custody. Meanwhile, Izuku had gotten himself into a bit of trouble. It was a bit dark that night, so when Izuku had seen bright flames lighting up the street down from his alleyway, he had quickly run out. There was hissing and yowling, as well as swearing. Izuku unwrapped the bandages from around his hands, his face set in a straight line as he ran towards whatever was threatening his cat, or any cat. Honestly, he couldn't stand to just sit in his alleyway while some poor animal was being hurt. He didn't hesitate when he saw the number 2 hero reaching for Dusk with flaming hands. He jumped forward quickly, wrapping the bandages around the hero's hand and letting his weight carry himself past the hero, dragging the hero's hand away from his cat. He quickly released one part of it, unwinding the bandage. Shoo! He yelled at Dusk, his voice robotically altered as the cat quickly ran off. The hero turned to Izuku, smirking. Healer, I heard you were hard to find. Turns out that people just weren't willing to do what they needed to catch a rat. Endeavor said with a scowl on his fiery face. Endeavor, I hear you're villainous, and it looks like my sources weren't wrong. Harming an innocent animal to get to me, Healer said, glaring at the flame hero. Now, no need to get so aggressive. I was thinking we could strike a deal. Rat, surely it'll be one you can't turn down, the hero said, with a wicked expression on his face. Healer frowned as he stretched his bandage between his 2 hands. He was glad he had reinforced it. I'm useless. You're gonna be the one getting the short stick of this deal, even if I agree, Healer said, glaring at the hero over his mask. I'm here to offer you a spot at my agency, provided you go get your licensing and everything. Or not. I probably have more than enough room to keep a rat like you away from the press. All you'd have to do is agree to heal me and my men. Endeavor said, smiling like he was the cat that caught the canary. Healer lifted an eyebrow, looking at Endeavor with a face that seemed to scream unamused. I heal everyone. I'm not gonna agree to heal your men and you exclusively. Healer stood firm in his belief, winding and unwinding the bandages around his hand. He was tensed up and prepared for the fight he knew was coming. Endeavor narrowed his eyes. Have it your way then. Let's see how your healing handles this, Endeavor announced, unleashing his hellfire. Healer looked around, trying to decide what to do to take the least damage and at the same time protect the buildings around him. The healer quickly found a way, grabbing a nearby metal trash can. He silently apologized to the people who would have to clean this up tomorrow as he threw it into the way of Endeavor's hellfire. While Endeavor was distracted, thinking he had hit the healer, said healer was running to the side, close enough to be hidden by the flames. He felt the heat through his hoodie and mask, even as he quickly jumped up. He put some spin into his jump and curled up slightly. When he was lined up, he quickly kicked out his legs, slamming both of them into the hero's broad chest, aiming for the bottom of the ribs as he spread his legs, so he was hitting the ribs instead of where the ribs interconnected. The healer could almost hear the ribs creaking and cracking under the force of his kick as he backflipped off the hero's chest. He ducked under a grab, wrapping the hero's elbow in his bandage as he dragged it back a bit. He quickly moved to behind the hero, keeping tension on the bandage even as the hero tried to set the bandage on fire, too focused on the bandage to turn around. He jumped up, throwing his bandage in a loop around the hero's neck. He pulled it tight and kept pulling tighter even as it cut off the hero's breathing. The healer focused on getting the hero down before he could do anything. He felt the hero's hand clawing at his hoodie, even as he pushed against the hero's back to tighten the bandage. He saw the fire before he felt it. The smell of acrid smoke filled his nose as he felt the number 2 hero tried to grasp at his face. Hand catching fire. However, Izuku had felt burns before, and Bakugos were normally very strong. He focused through his good eye. He grit his teeth through the pain as he felt the hero begin to go slack. Even as the hero began to slump over onto him, he didn't let up until he knew the hero was down. This resulted in Izuku lying underneath the number 2 hero, panting and groaning in pain. He didn't have the energy to try and push the hero off and honestly felt like puking. He closed his eyes, just wanting to rest them for a second. This was how Tamura found the healer. Holy hell, kid. Why would you do this? Tamura said, crouching down and removing the kid's half-melted hood to look at his face. The kid delusionally muttered something about dusk and bastards. And if that didn't paint a picture for Tamura that he didn't want to think about. Tamura shook his head, looking at the kid's face. The side of his face was lightly burned, but the hood and mask had taken the brunt of it. All right, kid. You shouldn't have any permanent damage. But, ugh, why'd your cat come to get me? It should have gotten Eraserhead or any of the other heroes. But then they'd arrest you and the hero commission would take you away. Or maybe they wouldn't. They'd get pretty bad press if they did. Fuck, you bastard, Tamura growled, standing and kicking the limp body of the number 2 hero. He huffed as he debated how to get help. He did know most heroes patrol routes. Kurogiri and Sensei kept him updated since he had been out more and more recently, recruiting. He could get Eraserhead. Eraser seemed to have a soft spot for the kid. Tamura looked at the kid. Figures. As soon as he wanted the kid's advice, he would pass out. He walked off to go get Eraser, hoping that the number 2 hero would stay out long enough that he could get someone that would be able to control the psychopath. He couldn't believe that some heroes had come after the kid just for healing people. He looked around, pulling down his hood to make it obvious who it was. He needed the hero to arrive as soon as possible and knew that Eraser would find him before he found Eraser. His idea proved truthful when the underground hero seemed to materialize behind him. As he felt the capture weapon wind around him, he did his best to focus on what he came here for. It's the healer. Endeavor got to him and he's a little hurt, but he's not in any condition to get up. And I can't lift Endeavor's heavy ass all by myself. If I bring anyone else, they might report him to Sensei, Tamura said as quickly as he could. Eraserhead paused for a second, seeming to analyze Tamura. If you are lying to me, you're ruining something that could save his life in the future, Eraserhead said chillingly. Tamura nodded simply, looking at the hero. You can keep the weapon around my arm if you don't believe me. I'll bring you to him. As long as you promise to let him go before night ends. I don't want you guys making us all seem like irredeemable monsters, even if some of us deserve it, Tamura said, shifting a bit. The Eraser hero didn't even say anything, just wrapping his capture weapon around Tamura's wrist instead. Tamura quickly set off to lead the hero to the healer's location. When they arrived, the vigilante was starting to stir. The vigilante looked at them, shifting to adjust something on his face. The vigilante probably realized his face was uncovered. His eyes widened in alarm. You don't come any closer, he attempted, squirming under the number 2 hero. Tamura sighed, looking at the vigilante. Sorry kid, no can do. We need to get you out from under this giant before he wakes up. Tamura said, glaring silently at Endeavor as he silently added another tally to the crimes against humanity that Endeavor had committed. The difference between this time and every other time, however, was that no one would let this pass by. Endeavor would get his karma, and then some. It took a few minutes, but they managed to get the healer out from under the flame hero and to his alleyway. However, the healer had admitted to being experienced in burns and said that they probably wouldn't even leave permanent marks with the way that he had figured out. Tamura frowned at that answer, wondering how the kid had gotten so experienced. He also remembered the first time he had met the kid. The new pack of painkillers. He stared in silent concern as the kid began to patch himself up. After a few minutes, he offered to help and helped the kid patch up. Eraserhead silently stood at the entrance of the alleyway, watching them closely. Tamura couldn't figure out why Eraser was watching them so closely. And if it was to make sure Tamura didn't do anything, Tamura didn't know whether to feel offended or proud. He had gotten such a reputation with the Eraser hero that he was concerned. But the Eraser hero thought he would hurt the only person who would willingly heal him. Did the Eraser hero think he could hang out so easily with just anyone? Tamura shook off those feelings as he patted the kid's curly hair. All right, healer, try not to get in any more fights with the top 10 heroes, K. Tamura jokes, smiling slightly. The kid stares at him, before casually saying, this is my second time in a month fighting him. I'll be fine. Anyway, you shouldn't worry so much about me. The kid looked away at the second part, staring off into the distance. Tamura was once again reminded that, despite feeling so close to the kid, he also felt so far away. He wasn't sure what put that look in the kid's eyes, but he did know that whatever it was made his neck and hands itch. Tamura, instead of answering, let out a small exhale. PSH. Whatever. If I didn't help you, I'm sure your cat would have murdered me in my sleep. And, anyway, someone needs to help you. The kid stared at him as if he was an extraterrestrial who had just manifested in front of him. The kid nodded slowly, blinking just as slowly. He didn't seem to know how to react to what Tamura said. Tamura shifted, standing up from his box as he looked at the Eraser hero. Tamura narrowed his eyes, debating what to do. He walked towards the hero, who straightened up. Tamura stared once again at the hero, before silently turning away and walking out of the alleyway. A silent tension is left unspoken between hero and villain. A silent promise that Tamura hoped the hero heard and understood. Even if the hero hadn't, the healer was so endearing he was sure Eraser would come around quickly. Okay, it had been a normal day for Izuku, just scrolling through the police registry. He had looked up, hearing the telltale meow that could only mean someone had arrived at his alleyway. He looked up with a small smile that fell when he saw Tamura standing there with Kurogiri behind him. Hey, Shigaraki, what brings you here? Izuku asked, shifting and closing his laptop. Dusk walked over and jumped onto his lap, causing Izuku to gently pet her while staring at Tamura. Well, kid, I'm here to make you an offer. I want you to join the League of Villains. Tamura offered with a chuckle which said that he knew the answer already. The healer deadpanned as he simply said, Shigaraki, I'm not joining your league. Tamura couldn't help but laugh at the way it was delivered. It's okay, healer. I knew your answer already, but I thought it'd be funny to ask anyway, Tamura said, not revealing that part of the reason was the hope to get help for the teen who seemed to be destroying himself from the inside out. At this point, Tamura was kinda pissed that no one else had stepped up to try and help the healer. Every villain that passed him knew that the healer underestimated himself to a crippling degree, so how was every hero so blind? Were they so naive as to see the young boy and think that he couldn't have a concern in the world? Tamura fumed silently, reaching to scratch. A small hand grabbed his wrist. Come on, Shigaraki, I have to heal that every time you do it. The boy complained. Whatever, Tamura said playfully as he pushed the healer's face away. The healer let out a noise as he stumbled away, laughing. The healer huffed as he turned away. Why were you recruiting in the first place? Last time you were recruiting you attacked the USJ. The healer said as he looked at Tamura. Tamura hummed, nodding a bit as he considered what to say. Did he admit it was because of the planned attack? Did he admit to the multiple other reasons that they tried recruiting the healer specifically? Tamura was rather open with the healer now that they had known each other for a while. The healer was a good kid, and Tamura really couldn't believe that he continued to associate with him after finding out about the USJ and Hasu. When Tamura had told the healer about the USJ and Hasu, the healer had stared at him for a long time. He had stared so much that Tamura had almost wanted to book it, even though he knew that the kid was thin as a rake and his only gimmick worked when people kept underestimating him. Tamura had patiently waited it out as the healer had turned, looking at his laptop, and then the healer had finally said, "There are better ways to do this," in a voice that was so blunt and emotionless that Tamura had to take a second to process. Tamura hadn't known how to react then, but he had gotten a thorough lashing from the kid. He had also been threatened with no more healing. which wasn't exactly what made him want to at least attempt to listen to the kid. No, it was the fact that if he couldn't find the healer, he was sure that the healer would disappear, and he worried one day he'd hear about the poor kid being dead, and knowing that if he hadn't been such a blind asshole, the kid might be standing within reach. I'm planning an attack on this camping trip so I can take this kid called Katsuki Bakugo, Tamura admitted in the present time, watching the kid seemingly convulse slightly at the name. Tamura froze as he watched the kid's reaction. He wondered what had been done to the kid for him to have that bad of a reaction to a name. We used to go to the same middle school. I can tell you about him. He wouldn't be a great candidate, the healer said, sitting down on their box yet again. Tamura nodded, sitting down and listening. He's completely obsessed with being the #1 hero. He's obsessed with it to the point where I'm pretty sure it's unhealthy. He does whatever he can to be a hero, and any challenge to him is seen as a personal affront and met with full force. Not only do I think he won't join, but if he did join, he'd be a horrible member. He'd go running off and wouldn't take orders. Tamura nodded as he listened, watching the healer closely. The healer didn't seem to like this person, so it wouldn't be good for them to be in the league anyway. The league was honestly full of people who seemed either neutral or friendly to the healer. A lot of Stain's followers were interested and friendly at the mention of the healer, and they had even managed to get Stain himself because of Tamura's own opinions on the healer, and also because Tamura had taken the healer's advice. That was beside the point. Any of the dangerous people they had were neutral to the healer, or curious if they haven't met him yet. They saw him as he was, someone willing to help wherever and whenever. There were only 1 or 2 people who wanted to hurt the healer. Tamura had taken them to try and make sure Sensei didn't notice his preference of the healer. He got a horrible feeling every time he thought of reporting the healer to Sensei. He sighed as he nodded. Well, we probably won't take anyone then, but I sure as hell want to make sure that we keep their attention. After Stain showed us up during Hasu, I want to make sure people know who to fear, Tamura announced. The healer stared at him. Why are you telling me all this? He asked simply. Tamura looked at him. Because I wanna. And, anyway, you're bound to show up to try and make sure we don't hurt anyone. Might as well tell you in advance, Tamura said, smiling. The healer nodded a bit, looking away and opening his computer. Well, I'll see you then, I guess, he said casually. Izuku didn't know what to think of Tamura's behavior. Tamura had opened up more recently, after chatting with Izuku about plans and stuff. Izuku still hadn't disclosed his name, but Tamura could honestly find him so easily because he had seen him without any vigilante gear. Izuku sighed as he messed up his hair, laying his head down on the box in front of him. He honestly was quite distressed. Somehow a lot of his fight with Endeavor ended up online. From Endeavor trying to catch Dusk on fire to Izuku as he laid under Endeavor and closed his eyes. After that, the cameraman was chased off by something, letting out a small noise before running off. The comments on the video were crazy, from people reassuring others that Izuku was, indeed, still alive because they had just visited him the other day, to people who demanded justice for Izuku and Dusk. Some of the general public was enraged on Izuku's behalf, and all Izuku could think about was that he didn't deserve it for even a second. He was useless, and that wasn't him taking down the #2 hero. He couldn't remember it. The public shouldn't care about useless Izuku. He couldn't help but try to insist that he was okay and people should stop worrying every time a villain or vigilante stopped by, panicking about the video, and wanting to make sure Izuku was alright. Some civilians had even managed to find their way to his alleyway. Izuku needed to think about getting somewhere else to set up. Maybe a warehouse would be good. He could find some way to get furniture and set it up so that he could work with multiple people. Izuku also needed to plan around that day. The day that he'd have to be gone to help Tamura not do anything stupid and to help the hero students. Izuku stayed there, letting Tamura and his small recruitment group go home. Izuku had noticed that some of them were whispering about him, but he couldn't bring himself to care. What anyone thought of a useless nothing like him didn't matter. Izuku stared at the wall, the dirty alleyway wall. He felt his stomach eating itself from the inside out, and wondered when he had last eaten. He shook it off and looked back at his screen. He began to type, preparing a few things. It was 3 days until Izuku packed up his things. The sun was setting, but Izuku knew his mother probably wouldn't notice that he wasn't there. Not that he was gonna judge her for not paying attention to Useless, because he didn't pay attention to Useless as it should be. Izuku grabbed what he needed, preparing for the camping trip he knew was ahead. He wondered whether he should bring Dusk with him. It might be smart, but what if one of the villains decided to hurt her? A hero had already tried. Izuku worried and decided not to after much debate. He shouldered his pack, forgetting the food he had set aside, but bringing his water bottle. And Izuku left, a simple note left for his mother that he'd be gone for a few days at a friend's house. He told her to call him if she wanted to talk, but had left the note somewhere rather out of the way. Izuku arrived when night fell, and quietly set up his little camping spot not too far away from the main camp. He hummed, setting up his hammock and throwing the almost ungodly amount of fluffy blankets he brought into it. He set the cover over it, opening the flap so he'd be able to get in, but leaving the bug netting over his hammock closed. It was a giant hammock, one he had gotten on a whim when he still wanted to be a hero. He had thought that having something like it would be useful. But useless was useless, and having useful things would never help useless. Useless stared at the hammock, wondering whether he cared. Useless frowned, but silently grabbed the electric lantern he had brought and got into the hammock. It rocked gently beneath him as he hooked the lantern to a hook in the top of the hammock. The hammock had a quick way to disassemble it, and Izuku had his pack hidden. He'd be able to come back if he was caught now. Useless laid down for the night, keeping the light off and staring in the distance, watching the outlines of hero students laugh and run around. Watching the lights at the camp slowly turn off. Useless wondered when he had stopped laughing like that. Useless frowned at these thoughts because Useless didn't deserve to have those thoughts. Of course Useless didn't laugh like that. Useless was useless. Useless closed his eyes, and Izuku Midoriya fell asleep. Izuku spent most of the next day in his tent but noticed the movement in the forest early. He packed up everything and hid it in his pack, putting on his vigilante outfit, which he had repaired since his run-in with Endeavor. Speaking of the Flame Hero, the public backlash wasn't dying down. It was getting worse and worse. The Hero Commission said they were going to put out a statement on it soon, and Izuku didn't know how to feel. On one hand, Endeavor was a flaming trash can. On the other, he was the number 2 hero. Izuku didn't know what he would do if something happened to the Flame Hero because of him. Izuku frowned, shaking his head. No, nothing would happen to Endeavor because of Useless. Useless didn't have that power. Useless walked and walked and walked until he was standing above something. It was a cliffside. He watched silently, standing back so that the kid with the hat that was walking up wouldn't see him. When the kid sat down, he walked over and sat down next to him. His voice changer hadn't been fixed yet, but he had a mask that covered his mouth and had the button for his hood, so it was all fine. Useless sat next to the kid, who looked at him. The kid seemed to realize something. "You're the healer," the kid said, almost excitedly. Izuku looked at the kid, confused. "Oh, yeah, I guess that would be me," he said, rubbing the back of his head with a small chuckle. "That's so cool. A lot of people don't like you because you're a vigilante, but you're nice and your cat is really pretty," the kid said excitedly. Izuku wondered how the kid knew this, and smiled from behind his mask, eyes sparkling. "Wow, kid, thanks. I'll tell Dusk that you thought she was pretty when I get home," he said, smiling happily at the kid. He had never expected a kid to look at him with that expression, especially one he had observed to be very aggressive to hero students. The kid nodded. "Okay, but, why are you here if it isn't home?" the kid asked. Izuku hummed, looking off into the distance as he saw a blue glow start. "Because I was told by a friend that there would be trouble," he said honestly, standing and holding out a hand for the kid. "Let's get you back to the camp," and the hero he was cut off by someone almost smashing the kid. If it wasn't for Izuku's quick reaction times, the kid would be dead. He looked at the person before him, a tall man, towering over them and looking like he could beat Izuku's ass without lifting a finger. Izuku swallowed down the fear he felt as he held the kid and stood tall. "Back down. No one's being hurt under my watch," Izuku said with as much bravado as he could muster, easily slipping into his role as the healer, the vigilante who healed villains and heroes regularly and had taken down Endeavor. The muscular villain looked at the healer, seeming to consider what he said for a moment, before grinning. A thing that made Kota shiver, but the vigilante growled. Like some type of animal, he growled and glared at the man that looked like he wanted to eat them. Kota was set aside, watching as the healer unwound his bandages from around his hands before looking around. The muscular villain was going on about something before charging the healer. The healer tensed before grabbing Kota. "Hold on," was all Kota heard before they were falling. Kota screamed because of course he did. The scream was torn from his throat as he gripped onto the healer. Then they were stopped and spun once, the healer letting out a grunt as Kota heard a sickeningly slick pop sound. Then they were falling again. And then the healer was rolling and he was being held close to the teen. Kota, despite his low amount of life experience, knew that he wasn't supposed to feel what he was feeling through the healer's hoodie. The healer groaned, letting go of Kota. "Go hide behind a tree, stay there until I call for you," he said, using one arm to push himself up to his feet. Kota couldn't help but stare horrified at his other arm. The arm that hadn't been holding him was completely limp, moving unnaturally as the healer recovered from the impromptu escape plan. The healer staggered, waving his good hand at Kota, and Kota could do nothing but numbly do as told. As Kota turned to look at his savior, he paused at his expression. It was a bright smile, a smile that rivaled many heroes, and Kota would later claim that no hero could ever really hope to match the healer's smile. The healer's mask had managed to shake itself free, and the healer's full face was within view. The healer laughed as he said, "I'll handle this, and I'll come to get you, and then you'll go home and find happiness." His tone was excited and gave Kota hope as the teen took off back towards the cliff they had just jumped off. Izuku, inwardly, was panicking. Not because he was in danger, but because as soon as he stopped fighting the villain, Muscular, if he remembered correctly, he didn't know what would happen to the kid. The plan to jump off the cliff had been a very quickly put together plan. He thought that if he jumped off and failed to break his fall, he'd be able to take the brunt of it and get the kid to run while Muscular probably rendered Izuku free of his limbs. However, he had succeeded in breaking the fall, and now he was proceeding with part 2. Limit Muscular's movement using trees and the cliffside. Izuku arrived at the tree line in time to see Muscular jump down from the cliff, shaking rocks down from the cliffside that rained down on the villain, small pebbles. A plan began to form in Izuku's mind, without his permission, and he began. He darted in, lithe form dodging most of the blows from Muscular. The limp arm was completely forgotten as he dashed around. That is, until he felt himself getting pulled back by something, thrown into a tree. Izuku gasped and groaned, feeling glad he had repaired everything because without the padding he probably would have folded around the tree and died right there. But that was okay because he didn't, and now he was getting up and fighting again, ignoring the pain in his stomach and the nauseous feeling. Izuku felt his arm be grabbed again, and his first instinct was to wrap the bandage that was wrapped around his hand around the branch he could reach. Then it happened. Blinding, agonizing pain. The sound of skin ripping. There was no pop because his arm was already not in the spot it was supposed to be. The noise was sickeningly wet, and Izuku saw his arm being pulled away from his body, the man who pulled it off taking a step back in obvious surprise. Izuku would swear, but he was rather busy calming himself down. He ran forward, running so he was against the cliffside. Muscular, probably losing it because he had his prey right where he wanted it, but it was continuing to evade him. Attack. He missed every time, loosening the cliff more and more. And then Izuku darted out at the last blow, only to turn around and watch, in slow motion, as rocks tumbled down and onto Muscular, one crushing his arm, pinning him there. Muscular had looked up in time to see the many other, heavier rocks tumbling down. He had let out a yell, before being buried under rocks. Izuku stared at the blood seeping out from under the pile of rocks, staring before robotically unpacking some first aid supplies and bandaging his wounded arm. It was still bleeding profusely, and wouldn't work very long. But he needed it to work until the end of this, at least. He ran to find the kid he had left, calling for him and ignoring the imminent signs of a panic attack. People needed to be saved. People mattered more. He needed to help people. He scooped the kid up, helping him onto his back. Please hold on. I'm missing an arm, he said, his voice getting faint at the part that mentioned his current disability. He'd worry about it later. People needed help. The boy's arms were wrapped around his neck, and he began moving. He ran as quickly as he could, which was fast. He fought through every bad feeling and reached the edge of the camp. He set the kid down, gently touching his shoulder to heal the small scrapes and cuts. He talked to the kid about anything and everything, trying to protect the kid from the real trauma of this situation even as he watched fire rise from the forest around them. Beautiful blue fire, but a fire that was not supposed to be here. Izuku looked at the boy. He pats his head, before taking off as he hears the underground hero approach. Izuku ran like hell, going towards the source of the fire. He redirected hero students, directing them around a gas cloud, then directing them back to their teacher. Izuku runs into a few lower-ranked villains who greet him in a friendly manner. They're probably here as throwaways. Izuku smiles and heals them, and they talk about quirks. Izuku then directs them to go because the police are probably gonna be here, and he just wants to make sure no one gets themselves into more trouble than they're already in. Then Izuku came across the cause for the flames. Icy blue eyes stared at him, before looking him over and noticing. The man smirked. Wow. Shiggy said the man paused, staring at the space where Izuku's other arm was supposed to be. What the fuck? When you beat the flaming trash, can you add 2 of those? He said, pointing to Izuku's arm. Izuku laughed, swaying on his feet a bit. Oh, yeah, I lost it when this attack started. You know, Savannah kid killed a dude. Just another Wednesday for me, he smiled, groaning at the headache he had. He walked over and laid a hand on the man's arm. He began working to heal the burn wounds he had. He hummed, going to fish around in his utility belt, before slowly staring at where his arm was missing. After a second he blinked, snapping out of it. Useless just lost his arm by being useless. Useless is useless. Useless deserved it. Izuku blinked, before using his still existing hand to get some burn cream. Here, your quirk hurts you, so use this when you hurt yourself. I don't have time. He took out a paper with a number and stuck it on the man's forehead. No more fire. Go back to wherever you guys hide. He tried to recall. Oh, yeah, text for Insta. He was stopped by the man putting a hand on where his arm was still bleeding. He took off all the bandages. After they were all gone, the man put his hand against the wound. The hand caught on fire and cauterized the wound quickly. Izuku winced a bit, frowning. After a second he looked at the man. Thanks, he said, his voice almost silent. He could only recall Aizawa and Tamura helping him recover from any wounds recently. His mom used to, but she was too busy. He smiled at the man, who seemed taken aback but nodded and quickly began to leave. Izuku smiled at his back before turning and walking away. He heard a high-pitched voice complaining about someone hiding the blood and quickly followed it. He was on autopilot. He was doing his absolute best to help as many people as possible. Izuku felt himself slowing down, his body refusing to move as quickly. Was it cold? Or was it hot? Why was that shadowy bird-looking thing charging at him? Shit, that's the boy with the sentient quirk. Izuku quickly ran towards the biggest and nearest fire, ducking down as the quirk pounced at him. It screeched as it jumped into the fire, smothering the fire as Izuku quickly stood and pushed it off. He didn't know whether it could get hurt, but he'd rather not take the chance. Then there was a girl. Or were there two? They looked the same. Actually, Izuku was pretty sure there were two of everything. His head hurt, he felt nauseous. His legs were weak. It was hot and cold. It felt like they were taking turns bouncing his body between the two extremes. He groaned as he stumbled, taking off his mouth guard which he had to put back on directly after leaving the kid with the hat. The boy with a bird head was saying something, but Izuku felt like laughing, so he did. He laughed a bit, before turning away and puking. He wondered at how much of it was stomach acid. Maybe there was some blood in it. He didn't feel like thinking about it too much. His head hurt, his vision was swimming. He was still seeing two of everything. He hummed, looking at the other teen, swaying on his feet. Look, I need to help people. People need help. Izuku mumbled, hoping that it helped the boy. The girl had run off, he didn't know where. He hoped she was okay. The boy was still talking. Or, Izuku thought he was. Maybe it was him thinking. Is that what his mumbling sounded like? Izuku stumbled, going down to one knee on the ground. He let out a soft noise as he placed his hand against the ground. Wow, no, I need to help. People. Useless frowned as the ground moved beneath him. It didn't feel like it was moving. It swam around his vision. Useless glared at the ground. No, he had to keep moving. He needed to keep going and help people. Useless had murdered someone. This was Useless's last thought as his body tumbled forward and he collapsed against the ground. Of all the people Fumikage expected to run across, the vigilante healer was definitely not one of them. He did not expect to find the vigilante's side drenched in blood. Fumikage could swear all the photos he had seen of the healer had two arms, not one. Fumikage prayed to whatever dark being was in charge of a being as chaotic as the healer that the wound that he had received was not from trying to help other students. However, the wound was still smoking and the blood was still dripping. That indicated a wound that had been burned. And the healer was almost infamous for being a neutral force that tried not to harm anyone permanently. Fumikage frowned as the healer stumbled. And Fumikage watched in amazement as the healer stripped himself of his mask and proceeded to puke on the forest floor. The healer was saying something about people. Fumikage couldn't help but wonder why the healer didn't help himself if he wanted to help people. Fumikage frowned as he saw the healer go down, reaching forward but being intercepted by blue flames. He stumbled back a few steps, balling up his hands as he tried to figure out what to do. He stared down the scarred figure that had sent the fire between him and the healer. The older man looked at him with a bored gaze, one that spoke of how little the man probably thought of him. The man walked forward, disappearing behind the wall of blue fire. The fire was soon put out, dying out by the will of its summoner. The man had the healer in his arms and seemed to be regarding Fumikage for something. Fumikage looked at the healer, before realizing something. It was that general studies student that sometimes helped him and his classmates. Fumikage paused, tilting his head slightly in curiosity. The man froze as there was a yell and the leader of the League of Villains came storming into the clearing, slipping on gloves as he approached. Fumikage felt his heart squeeze and stop in the face of the person who had caused his teacher and classmates so much pain. However, the man walked over to the healer and began to chew the other out for something, interrogating him as to what had happened to the healer. The man admitted to not knowing. The leader was clearly pissed, but also seemed to be debating something as he looked at the healer. The leader sighed as he stopped himself from scratching his neck. Fumikage felt he should keep that in mind for the future. Then Shigaraki turned to Fumikage. Fumikage froze up, expecting the man to start reaching towards him. However, Shigaraki didn't. The man narrowed his eyes from behind his signature hands, before moving and taking the healer from the scarred man next to him. We don't have the medical stuff to heal him, and I don't think his quirk lets him heal stuff like that, Shigaraki said to the scarred man, ignoring Fumikage. And, anyway, hopefully, they'd be able to do more for him than we can. If they can't, we'll deal with it then. Shigaraki said the last part with a sharp bite to his words which brought a slight smirk to the scarred man's lips. Great. He mentioned killing someone, the scarred man said, putting his hands in his pockets. Shigaraki turned to the man. He would never, Shigaraki said, looking affronted for the kid. The scarred man shrugged. I dunno, it's just what he said, the man admitted as he leaned against a nearby tree. Shigaraki seemed to consider this, looking at the boy who seemed kind of short. Fumikage had known he was short. It was kind of hard to not notice after seeing him take on Endeavor. However, he hadn't expected him to look this small. Shigaraki sighed. Before turning to Fumikage, you take him back to Eraserhead and tell him that he should get answers out of him, and that he should be prepared for when the kid wakes up, Shigaraki said, offering the unconscious teen to the hero student. Fumikage stared and was clearly suspicious, but reached forward to take the boy from Shigaraki. Fumikage expected to be weighed down, and so nearly lost his grip on the smaller male when he turned out lighter and smaller than Fumikage expected. Fumikage looked at the villain leader, unable to hide his sudden overwhelming concern for the avatar of chaos he held in his arms. Shigaraki sighed. Yeah, I know. Just get him to Eraserhead. The villain leader turned, looking at the scarred man. We did what we came for. You'll also want to get to your old man sooner than planned. It seems that people have been talking, and after the other day plans have been made. It'll happen sometime after he talks to the civilians to try and smooth over what happened, and civilians are starting to talk. Shigaraki was walking away while talking to the scarred man, who began walking after Shigaraki so that they could have a conversation. Fumikage stood there until they left, not wanting to get caught off guard. He turned around and ran, tempted to summon Dark Shadow but not wanting to risk it, especially now that the forest was weirdly empty of fire. When he reached the camp, he stopped as he noticed that so many students were already there, with tales of a person who had told them the way back, tales of the one-armed healer who helped them, and then Mr. Aizawa was there. He stormed over and took one look at the boy before taking him from Fumikage, muttering something about there not being a competition for problem children and winning something. Fumikage watched Mr. Aizawa barely pause at his lack of arm, and instead the man began to remove anything that was signature to the healer, that being the jacket since the mask was discarded somewhere else. Mr. Aizawa had then picked up the boy and headed towards the cabins, instructing someone to hide the hoodie for now. Shota could not believe this child's carelessness. He felt lucky that some ambulances and the police were heading this way. Shota sighed, looking at the kid's arm. He had heard from Kota that something had happened, and he apparently hadn't even heard Izuku scream. Shota sighed, sitting next to the kid. He was a person too. He could save more people if he helped himself first. He had to wonder how the kid lost his arm. Kota hadn't told him much about it, going pale whenever he talked about it. Speaking of Kota, Shota sighed as he stood and walked over to the door, opening it and letting Kota in. He knew that Kota was listening. He had been since he walked in. He had laid Midoriya on the bed already, letting the poor boy at least attempt to sleep. The sleep most definitely wouldn't be restful, and from what he'd seen, the kid needed to sleep after this. Kota stumbled in, nearly falling on his face. Shota used his capture scarf to catch him and set him on his feet. He huffed at Shota, but turned his attention to Izuku and ran over to the bedside of the teen. He looked at the teen, gently touching his arm. Kota looked at Shota as if silently asking the adult for help. Shota stared, not exactly sure what Kota wanted as he awkwardly stood by the door. It was about 20 minutes later that paramedics rushed into the building. It took seconds for them to all start talking at once. Each one mentioned another thing that was wrong with the problem child. He was dangerously underweight, hadn't eaten nearly enough food within the last few years. If anything, the medics said was something to go by. Shota tuned it out after the second medic mentioned the next wrong thing. Burn wounds, scars, signs of neglect. Shota couldn't believe some of it. Mrs. Midoriya was a loving mother, he knew this, but some of the worst things came out of someone with the best intentions. Shota desperately wanted to go back in time and get his hands on Midoriya earlier. Maybe he wouldn't have lost his arm, maybe he wouldn't be this thin. But the logic inside of Shota wouldn't stop pointing out that Shota would have never been able to catch him without this opportunity. Without Midoriya literally pushing himself until his body decided it had enough. Without Midoriya tearing himself apart. Shota watched silently, hiding how much it hurt to see Midoriya carted off in the ambulance. When Useless came to, Useless was in a white room. It was white everywhere. Useless sighed at the smell of medical supplies in a sterilized room. Useless had ended up in the hospital. Goes to show how useless Useless is. He stared at the white ceiling, listening to the beeping of white equipment. A light blue sheet, almost white hospital gown. Izuku looked over at the door as it opened. He was surprised to see the kid he had saved run over. He vaguely remembered the name Kota. He blinked as memories started coming back to him. Useless had killed someone. God, why was Useless so useless? He was supposed to help people. Izuku resisted the urge to puke as he smiled at the boy. He could tell from the look the kid gave him that it wasn't right. He dropped the smile, gently bringing his hand up to his face and touching his cheek. Kota stared at him, before jumping up and grabbing his hand, holding it. Useless looked at Kota and watched the kid smile. Kota smiled brilliantly as he said, "Thank you for saving me." Izuku blinked, before laughing a bit. "I didn't save you. That was the heroes," he said, because Useless could never do anything. The kid frowned as Aizawa walked in. Izuku looked at Aizawa, tensing up and prepared to run. Useless could never hope to outrun Aizawa, but he would have to try. Aizawa shook his head and Useless slowly relaxed as the teacher sat down in a chair he pulled up. Izuku kept his only hand relaxed in Koda's grip. Aizawa spoke, "Kid, what do you think you're doing?" Aizawa stared, his eyes boring into Useless. Useless stared at Aizawa, forgetting everything he had built up to keep Useless hidden. Useless wasn't supposed to be seen. Useless was supposed to be hidden. Why could Aizawa see Useless? Why did Aizawa want to see Useless? Useless shifted, helping people. People need help, and I'll help. Useless didn't mention being useless, because Aizawa wouldn't like that. Useless listened to Aizawa, and Aizawa spoke, "Midoriya, running into battle like that and getting your arm ripped off. You can help people better when you are fully put together." Aizawa frowned as he stared at Useless. Useless couldn't suppress a flinch at that name. It was Useless. Aizawa continued, "And, anyway, shouldn't you be helping yourself?" Useless didn't say anything as he stared at the white wall. And then something else white walked in. White with a suit, it seemed to be a dark blue. Useless couldn't focus on it. Useless listened as Nezu began to speak. Useless began to think about his notebooks and think about the information he had on each and every person here. Useless could escape from being useless by learning. If Useless was learning, he could forget about it for a little while. Useless looked up as he heard the name. "Izuku," Nezu called, with a smile that promised unending possibilities. "I want to talk to you when you're finally released." Useless nodded mechanically, knowing that when Nezu found out more about Useless and how useless he was, then he wouldn't want to talk. And Izuku blinked. He took a deep breath and pushed everything away, ignoring the stare that burned. He looked away at another white wall. He wondered why hospitals were white. It was quite an aggravating color. It hurts your eyes. It could make you go blind. Then Aizawa asks, "Izuku, what is with your quirk?" And Izuku answers, "My quirk, I call it Doctor's Blessing. I accidentally healed Shigaraki when I first manifested it. It's based on my knowledge of the subject and skin contact. I am the healer and the helper. I help everyone, and everyone was so nice to me. Other than Endeavor, I guess," Izuku said, looking away. Then Nezu speaks, "And why didn't you go through the sports festival and transfer? With our information on you, you could probably easily do so, even with your quirk." Izuku answers again, "I don't deserve it. I'm not a hero, and I couldn't be. It's been made clear to me. And, anyway, I'm pretty sure the Hero Commission is preparing something to make me a villain," Izuku said, curling up on the bed and hugging himself with his one arm. Koda made a noise of protest at the arm being taken away from him, clearly concerned for Izuku. Izuku wondered why they cared for Useless. Useless blinked as he looked at the piercing gaze of Aizawa. And then Aizawa spoke and said something that Useless disagreed with. "You know you're a person, too. You should help yourself before you try helping other people." And Useless let out a small scoff at that. "I'm useless," he countered. Then he remembered. He remembered each time he was broken. Useless, 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 useless. If he wasn't useless, this wouldn't happen. People didn't do this to other people. But people did this to Useless. People didn't do this to other people. What did that make Useless? Useless was a horrible, horrible thing. Even with a quirk, Useless was useless. It was also normal. Useless was useless, so he deserved this. Useless was a useless thing. Useless made himself useful for quirk practice or being a living punching bag. Useless was only useful for that. And even then it was only barely. Useless was horrible. Useless grabbed his head with his hand, balling his hand into his hair as he curled up. Useless shouldn't be here. They shouldn't be wasting things on Useless. Useless was horrible. Useless had killed someone. Useless didn't deserve any of this. These people should ignore Useless. Why were they looking at him? Why were they talking to him? Useless felt something touch him and flinched. And then Izuku blinked and looked at Koda, who stared at him incredulously. Koda's hand was outstretched towards the teen as if to try and offer comfort. Izuku blinked slowly and looked at Aizawa, who had an expression of dawning horror. And silence settled as two heroes, one child, and a vigilante sat in the hospital room. Izuku took his hand out of his hair, moving it a bit and marveling at the weird feeling of only having one arm. It would take some getting used to. He'd want to do practice both with and without a prosthetic so he wouldn't get messed up if someone managed to rip the prosthetic off or disable it. Izuku gently took Koda's hand but didn't smile. He felt oddly sad. He felt a bit like crying, for some reason. He watched Aizawa blink as he processed what Izuku said, but couldn't help but wonder why Aizawa was having such a hard time processing it. Izuku did not know of the puzzle pieces that had suddenly aligned in Aizawa's head. Izuku looked at Koda and smiled as he gently held his hand. He focused on the kid, chasing away any other thoughts. It would be 2 days later that, after a lot of pleading, a promise to attempt to get a transfer into the hero course, and more than a few threats to send him to a psych ward to get some serious help if he fell into bad habits, he was released from the hospital. He had promised to Nezu and Aizawa that he would try to get into the hero course, but couldn't help but wonder why they'd want Useless in the hero course. Izuku shook his head before opening up his phone. He stared at the press conference that Endeavor had done. The media had quite obviously painted the healer as the good guy, while Endeavor had tried to make the healer seem like the bad guy. Izuku couldn't help but wonder what people would do if they knew who he was. He silently turned away from his phone, closing it as he headed down the street. Izuku wondered whether what they said was true. Was he a person? Was he worth saving? How did he even go about saving himself? Izuku was stopped by hearing a familiar meow. He looked down at Dusk and smiled. "Hi, girl. You always seem to find me, don't you?" She let out a small mew and purred as she rubbed against his leg. "I wonder whether if I asked Tamura he'd get me my bag," Izuku said to himself. "Mostly." He sighed as he sat down on the ground, petting Dusk as she jumped into his lap, purring as she did. Izuku sighed as he pets her. "I wish I could keep you around me more, but I don't think my mom would let me have a pet. And, anyway, I wouldn't want to burden her more," Izuku said quietly, his voice nearly whispering by the end. He looked up as he heard heavy boots hit the ground near him, and nearly jumped out of his skin as he saw Stain standing there. "Calm down, healer. I just need a bit of help. And I promise it'll be something you'd do on your own if you had a media presence you could throw away that easily," Stain said, rolling his eyes at how quickly Izuku had gotten ready to run. Though, if you asked him, that was part of what would make Healer such a good hero one day. Dusk looked at Stain but merely flicked her tail as she rubbed her face against Izuku's chin. Izuku sighed as he looked away. "I dunno. It'll depend," Izuku admitted, chewing his bottom lip. Stain smirked a bit and gave Izuku an offer he didn't refuse. Shoto smiled as he saw another post from Bloody Noses. It had been a few weeks since the whole class had discovered that the healer was Izuku Midoriya, and Shoto could admit he was surprised he hadn't noticed the similarities. Bloody Noses openly admitted that their info came from the healer, who was also known as the Helper. So this all brought Shoto back to similarities. Izuku Midoriya, the short teen who had stood up to his father and left him speechless. The healer, the short vigilante who had stood up to his father and won in a fight without a combat-oriented quirk. And now Blood Noses, who was timing their posts almost perfectly to whip up outrage at his father, outrage at Shoto's situation, and outrage at his father for what he said. This also had a backlash against the Hero Commission, who had tried to support his father and point out that vigilantism was illegal and could be considered villainous, and that assault on a hero was highly illegal. They had ended up putting themselves in the line of fire. And Shoto heard that his father was having a public speech later to try and speak above all the other voices. His father was in deep shit. And all because they tried to make the healer seem like a villain. Though, a few people were now whispering that anyone found speaking against the commission on the healer issue was at risk of disappearance. Shoto was just happy that his father was finally getting the karma he deserved. Though, Shoto did have a lingering worry that it would somehow reflect on the family and get the rest of them hurt as well. Then Midoriya had been transferred. It had been nearly a month since the camp incident, and Midoriya had been dragged in by Mr. Aizawa. Midoriya had looked like he wished he could sink through the floor. Shoto's father hadn't been back from work for 2 weeks now, dealing with the sudden onslaught of bad press he was getting from one small kid. Shoto was amazed his father hadn't burned down his agency. He was so easily pissed off when in private. Midoriya had gotten a seat in the back corner and took a detour that avoided Bakugo's desk. Mr. Aizawa had watched closely, and Shoto felt slightly concerned for the boy. Though, as soon as Bakugo had seen him he began yelling. Midoriya had flinched slightly but ignored him. His head was down and he sat down at the seat. He seemed like he was trying to become as small as possible. Shoto looked away as Mr. Aizawa began to speak, and classes continued. Izuku didn't choose to transfer to WhatIf after a month of doing everything but applying to transfer into WhatIf. Aizawa had shown up at his class early and dragged him to WhatIf. He had kind of paid attention to Useless. It was weird, paying attention to it. It wasn't supposed to be looked at or paid attention to, so to pay attention to it. He went through those actions in a daze. When he made food he stayed in the kitchen until it stopped microwaving. He still hadn't gotten a prosthetic arm yet, but he still went out and did his work as the healer. No one could try anything since any evidence based on him having one arm was purely circumstantial, and there were plenty of other people with one arm. No one mentioned that he was the only person that fit all the requirements, and no authority dared to try and arrest the healer who was now so obvious in a crowd. People had asked him about his arm. Rumors had quickly spread, and now it was well known that the healer had one arm that he had lost under bad circumstances. Rumors had caught the attention of someone that Tamura seemed to worry about. Tamura had told him, of course, about his ethereal sensei, the person that Tamura would follow to the end of the earth. Tamura had tried to tell Izuku that sensei had caught wind of his existence. He had merely smiled and said that he'd be happy to help anyone. And it was truly almost anyone at this point. Izuku himself was a murderer now, so it didn't matter if they had killed someone, he was just as bad as they were. This news brought Stain over to Izuku more often. The Stain would drop by with wounds and Izuku would heal him. They'd talk, Izuku would heal Stain, and Stain would run off after not too long. Izuku's healing of stain got faster and faster every time, as was appropriate for his quirk. Izuku also continued his work as the helper, finding people that were worse than the worst, people whose actions could be considered worse than death to their victims. Izuku found corruption and horrible heroes and continued his work. He found people who he couldn't speak of their crimes because they made him sick, but he still managed to work on their folder regardless. Izuku found a way to live with one arm in this month he spent without, and did his best to avoid his mother not wanting to explain how he had lost an arm, even though she already knew he had. The hospital had called her and told her what had happened, but she hadn't managed to catch him to question him. It was the week before his forced enrollment into one that Izuku met more members of the League. Twice had joined them not too long after Izuku had met him. Izuku was happy to see him again and had greeted him cheerfully as Izuku always did. Izuku then was introduced to Dabai, the man with the scars that he had talked to. He seemed too serious, which made Izuku a bit sad to think that he was so serious, but he couldn't judge considering his situation. He then met Toga, who seemed expressive. She had spoken at a mile a minute, seemingly both about Izuku himself and about how his blood must look. Izuku smiled at her as he began chatting with the different members of the League. He talked to Dabai about the staples, since he didn't think that it was a very good way to make sure his skin healed right. Dabai had taken what he said into consideration and had acknowledged that Izuku was right. But it wasn't really about making sure his skin healed right. Izuku had then moved on, not wanting to get into something Dabai didn't want to talk about. Izuku looked up as he heard the sound of boots hitting the pavement. A red-winged hero stood at the entrance, staring at the group of villains and the small vigilante that was surrounded. It probably didn't look good for anyone, especially since Stain was a big-name villain now, even if the other villains weren't considered all that big yet. There was a second of stillness as everyone in the alleyway processed the situation. Izuku made a noise in alarm as Hawks grabbed one of his feathers and quickly threw himself at the hero. Dabai made to grab Izuku, seeing disaster before it even struck, and Stain drew a sword. There was a loud smack, and everyone but Dabai froze, then slowly looked down at Izuku, who had just tripped over his shoes and fell flat on his face. Izuku groaned in pain as he let Dabai help him up, pulling down his mask and rubbing at his nose. He laughed after a minute, nose dripping blood as he looked around at everyone. Toga was the first to become functioning, excitedly fluttering around Izuku as Dabai chuckled a bit at the younger's clumsiness. Then it was Stain, who sighed as he put away his sword and walked over, patting Izuku's shoulder and directing him to the box he usually sat on. Izuku sat down mechanically and wiped at his nose once more, looking at Hawks. "You came here for a reason, come on over. Ignore them, they won't do anything," Izuku said, wiping at his face to get the pieces of pavement off of it and to clean it, though he ended up smearing blood on it. Hawks awkwardly approached as Izuku waved off everyone out of earshot. "He won't tell me about his quirk if you guys are listening in," Izuku said, waving his hand at them. The others began to leave, leaving Izuku with the hero. There hadn't been much more to that night, and Izuku had gone about his days as usual. Until today, when he had ended up dragged to Class 1A. Izuku had skirted around Katsuki, avoiding him as much as possible even as the buzz started. Katsuki's buzzing had always been deafening. "Useless, you can't be a hero. Useless, how'd you get here? Useless, you pathetic leech. Useless, Auntie doesn't want you. Useless, 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 stop following me. Useless is what you are. Look at you, useless, useless, stop crying, pathetic useless." And Izuku fell back into the usual. The class had passed, but Useless hadn't noticed. Useless silently left the class when he saw everyone standing. He wasn't surprised when Katsuki cornered him in the locker room after everyone left, though Useless couldn't understand why he had. Everyone would probably encourage Katsuki to hurt Useless. Maybe it was so Katsuki could make it extra clear to Useless. Useless didn't hear him. Useless stared at Katsuki silently. Useless was silent as he watched Katsuki speak. He wondered whether Katsuki was happy he had lost an arm. He wondered whether Katsuki would be happier if he had sent Kota running and let himself do what Useless was best at doing, being a punching bag. Useless didn't notice Katsuki pausing, or the way that Katsuki's demeanor changed. Useless did, however, smile after he noticed Katsuki was quiet. He looked at Katsuki with a smile that spoke to how accepting he had become. And then Useless walked away. He walked robotically out of the locker room. He was interrupted by a man with blonde hair and a bright smile. Present mic, voice hero. His quirk was voice, and he was extremely adept at using it. A weakness was that it didn't travel well through the ground. Useless had always wondered how well the directional speakers shielded his neck from attacks. and Useless had deduced that anything knocking the breath out of the hero was a big weakness. Useless stared as the man asked who he was, not processing that it didn't seem like a question, but a test. Useless wondered why the man asked him since everyone seemed to know Useless. Useless debated answering because to not answer was rude, but answering was pointless because he was useless. Useless wouldn't know this until much later, but his eyes were blank as he answered present Mike. Katsuki came bursting out of the locker room, yelling for Useless to get back here. Right in time for Useless to tell Mike, with his blank eyes and dead smile, "I'm Useless, Mr. Yamada. You probably know that already, but I need to go catch up to my classmates already." Useless turned and left, his footsteps not even making a sound against the hard-tiled floor. There was silence in the halls, heralding the storm that brewed. There are times in life where one feels like opportunities slip through one's fingers as easily as water. It's often about another person, where you feel you should say something, but they're gone already. Where you want to grab them, but they're already so far away. Where you watch as someone walks towards disaster, desperately chasing after them, but unable to catch up. Where someone smiles at you, and suddenly you feel like you've said something wrong. Where someone looks wrong and you want to reach forward, but you can't. Hisashi watched silently as the boy walked around the corner to follow his class, before turning to look at Bakugo. Bakugo was frozen, holding open the door to the locker room as his mouth hung open, staring after the boy who had introduced himself as Useless. Hisashi stared at the young man, wondering what he should do. Hisashi wasn't unfamiliar with this brand of hopelessness. It was the same brand of hopelessness he felt when watching Shota sometimes. It was the same brand of hopelessness he felt right after the death of their friend, watching as Shota withdrew and came out. Changed. It wasn't exactly glaringly obvious, but it was there, especially for Hisashi. Hisashi was just as unfamiliar with Midori as. He didn't know what to call it. There were so many things. Sadness. There was probably some anger there. Resignation. Midoriya probably felt so bitter. Hisashi sighed as he looked away, wondering how to approach the issue. Hisashi remembered what he was here for. He looked at Bakugo. "You're expected at Nezu's office. He wants to discuss your middle school record and your continued attendance at UA." Hisashi said, looking at the hero wannabe and wondering how someone who called another Useless was able to get into the hero course. Hisashi then moved on with his day, carrying with him the story of a boy named himself Useless to tell his coworkers. All for One would be stupid to not watch the new competitor within the underground. Not that they were truly a competitor, but they were unique. It almost made All for One ache when no one would give him information relating to the new unique being that had entered the underground's orbit. It wasn't a being drenched in blood or one that carried with it an untold story of how it came to being twisted. No, it was something that helped and soothed the wounds of the others in the underground, bringing it this kind of cult following. Something both good and bad. Creeps, stalkers, protectors, the curious and the obsessed. It was honestly interesting. However, all had something in common. They wouldn't give All for One the information he wanted. It was frustrating. He knew they had a healing quirk, and it worked based on information. All for One wanted to get his hands on the elusive person for himself. Then Tamura had told him that the person gave an open invitation for healing. All for One almost laughed. He knew that the healer probably couldn't heal his wounds, so didn't bother for now. Just knowing that the door was open was enough for him for now. It was like being given an open door to a home where he could casually stroll in and do as he pleased. Once you knew you could do as you pleased, you'd let it sit until you truly had an idea as to what you wanted. All for One could wait for now. He could wait until he found a reason to approach. It had happened again. Katsuki didn't acknowledge present Mike other than a nod. Katsuki remembered. When Katsuki had been insulting Useless, he had noticed something. On that day in middle school, Useless had looked at him and his eyes had been dead. Katsuki had been drawn to a complete stop in his tirade as he tried to recall the last time Useless's eyes had shone the way they used to when they talked about quirks and heroes. Katsuki had heard Useless ask him what he said, and it felt as if he had been stabbed. Useless looked so dead and seemed so far away. And Katsuki suddenly realized that he had pushed the kid he had once considered a friend so far away. Useless deserved it, though. Useless finally listened. Katsuki had turned away, leaving Useless alone because Useless was supposed to be. Useless was weak and should have listened from the start. Maybe if Useless had, he wouldn't look like that. Katsuki couldn't stand to look at Useless. He couldn't stand to look at the photos. He couldn't stand to look at the old plans to be a hero duo. He couldn't stand it, so he didn't. He hid them away, at the bottom of drawers and underneath boxes upon boxes. However, sometimes, in the middle of the night, Katsuki would stay awake. He would think about the pictures hidden away. He would think about the plans. He would think about the betrayal of Useless never developing a quirk. He would think about Useless not listening. He would think about Useless, not as Useless, but as Izuku. And Katsuki hated it. He hated those moments where he remembered a young boy chasing after him yelling "Catchin'." When the attack had happened, Katsuki found himself thinking, in a second of weakness, what would Izuku do? Izuku. No, useless. Useless, the self-sacrificing idiot. The one who defended others when he couldn't defend himself. Useless being the one who seemed to consistently put himself in harm's way. What would Useless do? And Katsuki couldn't help but think that Useless would have put himself in front of everyone. Katsuki didn't watch when Useless hung out with some of his classmates. Katsuki didn't watch Useless because he couldn't stand to see him anymore. He couldn't see Useless without noticing. Katsuki let Useless exist and didn't look at him. And then there was the talk after the camp. It was no longer confined to people muttering about a boy who healed them. Instead, people openly talk about Useless. Apparently Useless had a quirk. Useless never told him about it. Useless had hidden the fact that he had a quirk. That made Katsuki's blood boil. There was no way. Useless would never hide something that big from him. Useless would have run to Katsuki as soon as he discovered that he had a quirk. Right, surely, Useless couldn't have a quirk. Katsuki would know. So when Useless had been dragged to their class by Mr. Aizawa, Katsuki couldn't believe it. He outburst, demanding that Useless tell him how he got a quirk. Demanding that Useless tell him that he didn't have a quirk. Demanding that Useless reassure him that Useless would surely tell him if he had a quirk. Useless had skirted around him, and Katsuki involuntarily relaxed when he saw the familiar behavior. This was still Useless. Katsuki couldn't believe he had relaxed. Stupid Useless. Then it happened again. Katsuki had cornered Useless again like he used to. Useless had been rather quiet during the whole thing. Useless had stared at him with dead eyes. Useless had stared at him with empty eyes. Useless had not looked human then. And Katsuki was suddenly reminded of all the times he had listened to others quietly tell Useless advice. To jump off the roof, to find a noose, to go die, to jump in front of a car. It had always hit Katsuki wrong, and he had always shaken it off. And then he had finally snapped and said it himself, telling him to take a jump off the roof, to find a quirk in the next life. Katsuki had known it was a horrid thing to do. He had known he shouldn't say it. He had known he should have just left. However, there had been a horrifying sense of satisfaction in that. Katsuki had felt satisfied and then horrified in his satisfaction. This had been a friend. This was once a friend. Useless was once a friend that he had made plans to be a hero with. And Useless smiled at him, an empty smile, as empty as his eyes. And all that Katsuki could think of was Useless taking his advice. He thought of dead eyes and a dead smile lying broken on the pavement at the bottom of the school. And Useless walked by Katsuki as if he wasn't there. Katsuki was busy, thinking of empty eyes and dead smiles. Empty, empty, empty. Echoes of a happy laugh and smiles played over it. Katsuki blinked, before turning around and bursting out the door after Useless, demanding Useless get back here. If only to make sure that the empty wasn't the last thing. And then there had been present Mike, and Katsuki was now standing there, left behind by the empty, left behind by Useless. By Izuku, Nezu had sent present Mike to interrupt Bakugo's tirade against Midoriya. It was caught by a camera that was outside of the locker room, and Bakugo was loud enough that the microphone caught it. Nezu had already heard from Shota that something had happened between the two, that there was probably extensive bullying. Though no specifics were known, Nezu could see why Midoriya was so well loved by the public, heroes and villains alike. He was a likable kid. He was smart, but not arrogant, and so eager to help it was unhealthy. And he generally got a positive view from the public. Pictures of him with random stray cats and his cat, Dusk. Sometimes pictures of him animatedly talking, eyes sparkling behind his mask as he was captured mid-gesture. Other times it was him talking to some person he was healing. From kids to the elderly, he'd hold their hand and talk. Some videos of him talking about quirks had gone viral because of how detailed and skilled the analysis was. Nezu had listened to Aizawa talking to Midoriya. He had watched Midoriya name himself Useless. Nezu had watched with a calculating eye and couldn't help but think about numbers. Numbers were a thing Nezu was familiar with. However, he was most familiar with them from when he was younger. In the lab, they were referred to as subject number 20. Not names. When he heard Midoriya call himself Useless, he couldn't help but think about the animals in the lab who called themselves a number. Nezu tended to avoid those thoughts. Though it was a bit irrational to avoid them, it was natural. Nezu silently followed Bakugo in the cameras and prepared for the reaction to what he was about to say to the young hero. Shota didn't comment when Izuku walked in late, merely directed him to join with everyone else in their training. Izuku easily joined his group, but still seemed distant, like a ghost, merely passing through the physical world. The description of a ghost fit him well. One wouldn't know he was passing through if he didn't make his presence known. A simple shade flitting by. Shota watched as Izuku talked to each of his friends, lightly touching their shoulders as if to reassure them that he was still there. Then Todoroki had joined them and Izuku had smiled easily. His eyes haunted but looking a lot more alive than they had when he first walked out. Todoroki had talked to Izuku stiltedly at first, seeming closed off to the other members of the little group. However, it didn't take long for the rest of the group to open up, and soon Todoroki was part of it. Izuku talked to his friends and gave advice that they took and applied if their improvements showed anything. Shota turned to look at the group of kids who usually hung around Bakugo. They seemed to be quietly talking to each other, discussing Bakugo's outburst when Izuku walked in. Shota got a text from Hisashi and opened it. He blinked a few times when he saw it, before taking a deep breath. He then calmly typed back. He had known Izuku had problems, but that was quite the problem. Mrs. Midoriya had said she'd talk to him, so Shota could only hope that his mother would get through to him. Inko Midoriya, about a month ago, would have called herself a good mother. She tried her best for her son. She worked hard and did her best. She had never stopped to consider whether what she did was the best for her son, or whether it was the best for her. She never considered whether she was working these long hours for him, or for herself. She never considered how the house felt empty sometimes, and she thought of the man who had sired her child. She never considered that she might have fled that emptiness as quickly as possible. Inko Midoriya moved forward as quickly as her son did, often forgetting to look back and reconsider, forgetting to see. She considered how many times she had come home to food sitting in the microwave, having gone cold, to the number of times she had come back and found the house oddly quiet, dismissing it as her son already being sound asleep and not checking to make sure. Inko Midoriya was a mother. She tried her best, but her best had failed her baby boy. Her best had led to poor little Izuku considering himself useless, inhuman, a thing. Her best had led to an Izuku that floated through life, spectral and disconnected. Her best had left her baby with one arm, and Inko was forced to think. She couldn't bear to look at Izuku, her baby boy that she had failed. Not right now. Not when she'd look and see his missing arm, and only think about how she could have done better. Think about how she had failed her baby and there was no way to change that. Inko needed to sort herself out, talk to Izuku, and get him some help. Shoto had felt awkward, approaching the group to thank his savior for helping him. Shoto had approached slowly, feeling like he was an intruder in every sense of the word. Then Midoriya had turned and smiled. It wasn't a brilliant smile with sparkling eyes filled with excitement and uncontained mirth like they had been when he had pulled Shoto away from his father, running from threatening the second-place hero. It was a tired smile, one that spoke of miles walked in shoes that didn't fit and years spent in a life that took everything out of you. It was a very human thing to see, even though Midoriya seemed to glow and seemed to catch the attention of everyone walking by. He was just as tired as the rest of them. He may even be more tired than some of them if Shoto's ideas were correct. When Midoriya wasn't paying attention, Shoto heard the others talking. They talked in hushed whispers, discussing the best support course student. Shoto watched curiously and somehow ended up involved. Soon enough he was quietly discussing which ones would be best for their secret project. Tamura had been relieved when the rest of the league had reported back to him that the healer seemed to be doing fine. He seemed to be adjusting to living with one arm just fine, though no one had been able to tell him how he had lost the arm. They were able to guess just fine after they had found Muscular under the cliff, and Tamura had disintegrated enough of the rocks to see the arm of Izuku Midoriya lying nearby. Tamura had disintegrated it since that was the smartest thing to do to hide Izuku's identity as much as possible. Twice had figured out that Izuku had done it to save some kid, and hadn't seemed to stop for a second to consider his wound. Had Dabai not stopped him, Izuku probably would have still gone on even after meeting with the bird kid. But Dabai's interference had interrupted Izuku enough that he didn't have the adrenaline pumping through him to keep him going forward. Tamura almost wanted to turn Muscular into a Namu, if only so he could get the satisfaction of destroying the man himself. The healer was protected by a lot of other, decently powerful, villains. This meant that other villains were looking for whoever had removed the arm from the vigilante. A lot of villains were suspicious that Endeavor or the Hero Commission had it done, and Izuku would neither confirm nor deny this. Izuku would merely say that he had it removed and would stay silent on reason or way of removal. To add to this, Sensei had suddenly had an increase in attention, since it was proven that the healer couldn't heal himself. It had been something like an open secret. Everyone knew it, but no one confirmed it. However, Sensei had calmed down after Tamura told him that Izuku would be open to healing him. Though, for some reason, the idea of Izuku and Sensei meeting sent waves of dread rolling through him. Tamura quietly reassured himself that it wouldn't happen. Nido Monoma is, normally, what you would consider a good person. By normal standards, he had flaws, as everyone does. As such, Nido couldn't help but feel jealous. Nido couldn't help feeling consumed with jealousy as he watched kids play with their quirks. Nido couldn't help but want to reach and try for himself. He couldn't help but wish that they wouldn't call him a copycat, that they wouldn't mock him for having to rely on another for a quirk. He couldn't help but feel bitter when he got into Class 1B. Not that they weren't a good class, but that everything felt overshadowed by 1A. It reminded him of when he was little, and he'd excitedly explain his quirk, only to be passed over. Everything 1B did was overtaken by 1A. No one looked twice at 1B, except for Midoriya, the general studies student who healed everyone from each hero class. He'd laugh and talk, eyes sparkling as they discussed quirks. When Nito had inevitably ended up being approached by him, Nito couldn't help but feel apprehensive. It was likely the boy would pass over his quirk, but he hadn't. He had smiled just as brightly and asked just as many, if not more, questions. He had gone on and on about uses. He had gone on, and Nito couldn't help but smile back. When Midoriya had approached him during the sports festival, Nito had taken what he said and considered it. One wasn't full of stereotypical assholes. It was true for most of 1A. Shinso was pretty okay, and he had a quirk most would consider villainous. Most of his points in the exam had been rescue points. He had been a big part of a joint rescue operation carried out by a few students. Only the people involved knew all the details. But Bakugo was a stereotypical asshole. He was constantly demeaning everyone. Bakugo had always come across as an ass, but when Nito had watched from afar, silently blending into a wall by just watching in silence, as Bakugo chased after Midoriya, an insult dying on his tongue when he noticed Midoriya was already gone. Nito had felt a silent fury at the boy who insulted one of the nicest people Nito had met, but it did give Nito something to tell Class 1B. They weren't happy about it either. And then it happened. The beginning of the end. Endeavor released a video demanding the healer turn himself in, and for anyone to arrest the healer on sight. The Hero Commission backed up Endeavor's words. The healer was a vigilante who had overcome the number 2 hero and was very dangerous. The healer was to be detained on sight, and gates of hell opened. Villains began plotting, citizens began getting angry, and heroes began fearing. Izuku Midoriya he began learning. Izuku Midoriya was currently following his friends, who had allowed Monoma to join them after a small argument which Izuku had intercepted and calmed. Though, Izuku was oblivious to the glares that his whole friend group now sent Bakugo when his back was turned. That was also a new development. After the day in the locker room, Bakugo had been kicked from the hero course. He had been moved to the general education course and, from what Izuku overheard, he was going to therapy. He was allowed to re-enter the hero course next year through the sports festival, though he was oblivious to the plotting of many of his classmates, as rumors had spread. It had originated from Class 1B. They began talking about Bakugo and Midoriya. Someone had gotten their hands on a recording. It was a recording of a lot of the times that Bakugo had bullied Midoriya in middle school. One of Izuku's classmates had recorded it after learning about Bakugo's desire to become a hero and seeing how Bakugo and his gang treated Midoriya. And then the end of the recording was the biggest thing Bakugo had done. The thing that Izuku had heard echoed by so many, but not by the now ex-friend. Until then, believe that you'll be born with a quirk in your next life and take a dive off the roof. It cut off after that. And now almost everyone knew it. Bakugo's old friends were uncertain as to what to do. However, Izuku's friend group was otherwise unaffected, and now they had dragged Izuku somewhere blindfolded because they had a surprise for him. Or, that's what they claimed. Izuku had no idea what they were talking about. Izuku was a bit surprised when he heard metal clanking and the various other noises that tinkering with random bits and bobs came with. He let his friends guide him through, and it wasn't long before they began speaking. So, we were thinking, and we know the whole arm incident isn't ideal. And we know that you probably wouldn't take the initiative to get a prosthetic on your own, Ochako began. And that you probably wouldn't get the best. Because we know you, Shinso added, interrupting Ochako. Shoto finished it, so we got you something. And then Izuku's blindfold was removed. It was a sleek black prosthetic, with a logo on the side of it. It seemed rather complicated and Izuku looked at his friends, before noticing the pink-haired girl from the sports festival. Oh, Ms. Hastoom. It's so cool to meet you, Izuku said excitedly, moving forward and offering his hand for a handshake. Hatsum seemed a bit surprised, but also proud to have been recognized. Hatsum shook his hand excitedly, leaning forward into Izuku's personal space. It was only because he had gotten used to people through his work as the healer that he didn't lean back. Just call me Mei, she said excitedly as Izuku smiled. Call me Izuku, he said, in a measured and practiced way. A thing he had to do after accidentally introducing himself as useless to someone in middle school, and apparently would have to start doing again if him telling Mr. Yamada that he was useless was an indicator. This didn't go unnoticed by his friends, or by Mei. Izuku couldn't let useless be noticed, even if he had to pay attention to it more. Izuku had been forced to think over things recently. His friends noticed that Izuku was spacing out and quickly decided to step in, beginning to talk to Hatsum and discuss the prosthetic. Izuku shifted, looking at his hand, then at the prosthetic. He walked over to the prosthetic and traced a hand over it, careful not to accidentally activate anything. Useful and useless. Useless, useful. It was a name he had made for himself before Useless had gotten it into its head that it was useless. It was a name made to try to reassure Useless, but it had been quite futile at the time. When surrounded by people who echoed the same sentiment, it tended to ingrain itself. Izuku hummed as he heard one of his friends call for him. He looked into the eyes of Shinso and smiled. Why don't we get this on me, and then we can go look over what May surely put into it, Izuku said happily. His friends all shared a look and May eagerly nodded. You're gonna love my baby, she said excitedly as she picked up the arm and began to guide Izuku through attaching it. It was a rather easy attachment. Not overly attached because his friends didn't know how Izuku would want it. May did a few things to calibrate it so Izuku could use it. Izuku easily complied with what she asked, moving the arm in various ways to make sure everything was calibrated. Afterward, they all migrated to the training grounds. May excitedly explained to an enraptured Izuku what her baby could do. Izuku, who knew decently well how to make support equipment, excitedly listened. He learned what he could from May. They went over some of the functions together, but May said she wouldn't tell them all of them because she felt Izuku should find out for himself. Izuku was pretty excited about that. Izuku smiled and thanked his friends profusely, and all his friends asked in return was for him to eat properly. Izuku had laughed nervously. I don't know whether I can promise it, but I'll try my best, Izuku said, looking away. Ochako nodded quickly. As long as you're trying, that's the most we can ask for. Ada moved, stiffly nodding in agreement. We cannot force you to eat, Ada said, causing the whole friend group to look at him like he'd gone insane. You know, having Shinso order me to eat is still technically forcing me to eat, Izuku said, frowning as he looked at Ada. Ada blinked, before shaking his head and continuing, the friend group ignoring Izuku's protests as they all headed to class, and Todoroki led Izuku by his arm so Izuku didn't try to skip class. Izuku did that every so often. Whether it was because he forgot and had wandered off to heal someone, or whether he was still believing he was somehow unworthy of being in the class, his friends didn't know. Bakugo was walking ahead of them but was, oddly, alone. Izuku barely had a chance to glance at him before Todoroki stepped between them, grabbing Izuku's wrist and leading Izuku onward. Monoma glanced at Bakugo but looked away dismissively as he followed the group of friends. They split where they had to, with Izuku excitedly saying goodbye to Monoma and saying that he was happy Monoma was getting along with 1A. Monoma made an allusion towards a common enemy and Izuku couldn't help but frown. I mean, I guess. But technically I'm a villain now. Izuku was cut off by Ochako jumping forward, grabbing his non-robotic arm. Don't worry about that. We gotta get to class. We don't want to be too late. Mr. Aizawa knows we were going to get your arm, so he'll excuse some of it, Ochako said, smiling excitedly as Todoroki continued into the classroom. Ada nodded and walked in as well, greeting Aizawa. Izuku had a bad feeling about today, and he would be correct. After class, Aizawa pulled him aside and began talking to him about hero names. I'm not gonna be a hero, Izuku said, looking at Aizawa. Aizawa looked at Izuku before calmly saying, you're in a hero course, you'll need a hero name. Izuku sighed, looking away. He knew that the one he immediately thought of would displease Aizawa. Izuku hummed, before getting an idea. The unlikely hero, useless, Izuku tried. Aizawa gave him a look that Izuku understood loud and clear. He huffed as he looked away, thinking about what he could do. Izuku reviewed his knowledge of healing through the years, something he had gotten into when researching for his quirk. He landed on a random bit of knowledge. The inevitable hero, Asclepius. Aizawa lifted an eyebrow. Are you sure you want to go with that? He asked simply, looking at Izuku. Izuku nodded with a smile, and couldn't help but feel kind of giddy to finally be doing this after having taken so long knowing that being a hero was unreachable. It was still unrealistic to think it was within reach now, but having a hero name made things weird. Now, what careers are you interested in? Aizawa asked. Izuku blinked and stared at the man. Aizawa stared back for a second, before sighing. Really? Were your only career thoughts hero? Aizawa asked, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Aizawa shifted, leaning back and crossing his arms. With your tendency to want to help, I'd suggest going into therapy of some sort, specifically something surrounding villains, since all your friends seem to be villains. But only after you go to therapy yourself and get your problems sorted out, Aizawa said. The teacher was understandably displeased at the student interacting with the villains. However, they didn't seem to want to hurt one of their few avenues of healing, and some of them were quite friendly with Izuku and he enjoyed hanging out with them, so the teacher would stay out of it for now. Izuku looked away, rubbing his chin. I'll think about it, he said, looking back at Aizawa with a smile. And Izuku felt something a bit like hope. He held this feeling a bit starstruck with it. He didn't notice the teacher watching in silence as his student reveled in the feeling of restored hope. He didn't notice the quiet sadness in the teacher's eyes as he watched someone find something that they shouldn't have lost. Izuku realized he had looked away from Aizawa and looked back at him, a blinding smile with stars in his eyes. Thank you, Mr. Aizawa. You gave me something to think about. I gotta go now, Izuku said, getting up quickly and grabbing his bag, pulling out a black hoodie and running out the door. Aizawa watched in silence, speechless at the sudden blinding smile. Izuku ran out of the school, dodging students and teachers with unending ease. The teachers and hero students seemed to have been concerned about him. Izuku couldn't figure out why. He hadn't seen anything unusual. Izuku jumped the fence because he saw Mr. Yamada by the gate. Honestly, it was kind of funny how easy it was to climb the fence if you had the right gear. And with his new prosthetic arm, it was even easier, though he had to get used to the now superhuman strength he had in his arm. He dug his fingers into the concrete of the wall, humming at how that felt, but deciding that it wouldn't be good to do that to the wall. He quickly fashioned himself something. He tied the 2 hoodies he brought together, then tied one to his backpack. His backpack was heavy, because Izuku brought a lot of textbooks to class, both for strength training and because he read a lot of biology books to enhance his quirk. He hoped that by understanding certain things completely he might be able to figure out new ways to use his quirk, even if it was a rather basic quirk. Not that he was complaining. Izuku used his prosthetic arm to lob the backpack over the top of the wall, humming as he wrapped his natural hand in the hoodie and began to pull himself up. Once he was at the top he stood, untying the hoodies and the backpack. He looked up when he heard someone call his name. Not finding whoever it was, he waved to the small crowd of people who were either just leaving or hanging out after school. Izuku made a noise in alarm as he saw Mr. Yamada storming over and quickly jumped off the top of the wall, rolling as he hit the ground, grunting at how heavy his backpack was, and he got stuck on his back. He got to his feet, staggering a bit under the weight before righting himself and setting off. He put his civilian hoodie in his backpack, folding his healer hoodie so the plus signs were hidden. He was a bit surprised when he saw Dabai walking over. He had gloves and a face mask, covering up most of his scars. He stared, watching Dabai approach, frozen as he tried to decide what he was supposed to do. Should he act naturally? Should they act like strangers? Should he use an alibi? Should he act like a friend? Dabai chuckled and placed a hand on his shoulder, walking forward with him. "Hey, short stack," Dabai said casually. Izuku huffed in indignation, glaring because he knew Dabai was right. "I took your dad down in a fight. Don't think I won't hang you from the street lamps," Izuku said, crossing his arms over his hoodie like he had won a fight already. Dabai laughed. "I don't doubt it, shorty. It's always the small ones you have to watch out for. They'll fucking bite off your hand if you give them a chance," Dabai said with a smile. "Luckily, I won't underestimate you like my old man. Though, I will admit that what you pulled with him was a good use of your environment." Izuku took a second to think about it, wondering who Dabai was talking about. Suddenly blood flashed and rocks fell, and Izuku almost fell with it. Dabai grabbed him under his arm and supported him. "Hey, you've put on the smallest amount of weight since I last had to pick you up," Dabai said cheerfully. Izuku stared at Dabai like the crazy man he was. "I didn't know that you ever had to do that," Izuku said. Dabai shrugged. "I did it when you passed out, right before that bird boy, the one with the bird head, not the hero. I mean, technically he's a hero, but a baby hero. You get what I mean? Anyway, right before the bird boy grabbed you, I grabbed you because I wasn't interested in getting arrested," Dabai said casually. Izuku stared as he tried to process all this. That and Stain recognizes he as a good guy, though he did predict that you'd eventually take the mantle of heroism. "And it looks like he was right, baby hero," Dabai said, hooking an arm around Izuku's head and ruffling his hair. Izuku made a noise in protest and squirmed. "Stain is delusional. I'm not cut out for heroics," Izuku protested as he wrestled his head free from Dabai's hold, only avoiding falling because Dabai effortlessly grabbed his upper arm again. "He said you'd say that. Anyway, like your new arm, thanks for not breaking my arm right there," Dabai said, rubbing the place where Izuku's prosthetic had grabbed, knowing it had bruised later. "Thanks, a kid from support made it. She's a great inventor," Izuku said honestly, shifting as he looked at the arm. He'd have to research into mechanics more to see whether he'd be able to make personal adjustments to it. "That's great," Dabai said honestly, nodding a bit as if to affirm his answer. "Anyway, I'm out here for a reason, so I gotta go. Though, let any of us know if you need anything," Dabai said, and for some reason, Izuku felt that those words held ominous meaning. "Oh, yeah," Dabai paused, looking at Izuku try to keep the other students from joining Endeavor's agency. "I heard shit's about to go down there, and you stay out of it, or I swear I'll tell Shiggy to sick Kurogiri on you to make sure you stay in place and you won't be able to do any hero work until everything is said and done. Vigilante work either." Dabai ran off afterward. Izuku blinked, trying to figure out whether he should intervene. After a long minute of deliberation, Izuku decided that whatever it was couldn't be that bad, right? Endeavor had gone through scandals before. At the most, it would be a protest, maybe some rioting. Izuku couldn't possibly have been the cause of all this. Surely Stain did most of the work. Surely he made the people angry with the information Izuku gave him. Though, he was sure it was because Stain knew how to do stuff like this. Izuku nodded to himself, humming as he walked. He noticed people looking at him, but dismissed it rather quickly. Izuku did not notice the officers that would occasionally be intercepted or the tension that his mere existence was building. He walked, unknowing of the threads he frayed by taking his steps. Izuku sighed as he opened the door to his home, before pausing as he noticed something. The lights were on, and it smelled like food. His mom didn't usually come home until nightfall, at the very least. Izuku slowly walked into the house, looking at his mother. She smiled at him, indicating to the table, "It'll be ready soon. Sit down. I want to talk." Her voice softened at the end and sounded almost regretful. Izuku couldn't help but wonder what she could be regretting. Useless didn't deserve her attention. Useless didn't deserve to be walking over to sit down and wait for. Izuku blinked as she walked over to him, staring up at her. She looked at him for a while, before raising one of her hands to his face, leaning her head against his. Izuku inwardly panicked as he saw her eyes fill with tears, his hands instinctively coming up to wipe them away. Mom, what's wrong?" he asked, alarmed. "I'm so proud of you," Inko said, her hands dropping from his face to his shoulders, wrapping around them to hug him tightly. "I'm so proud of you, my little Izuku." Izuku's eyes widened in alarm as he froze, hands staying where they were as his mother buried her face into his shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Izuku. I'm so sorry." Inko sobbed into his shoulder, and Izuku wrapped his arms around her. Izuku felt his eyes watering, but didn't understand why. He blinked, feeling the tears track their way down his face as he hugged his mother tightly, careful with his new prosthetic. Izuku let out a quiet sob, gripping onto his mother's shirt as he buried his face into her shoulder. Izuku didn't know why he felt sad. Maybe it was empathy, or maybe it was something else. Maybe he was mourning something. It felt like he was mourning something. Izuku didn't know what, though. He felt like he wouldn't know for a long time. After a little while of them both just finding comfort in each other, as they should have done long ago, Inko was the first to pull away. She gave Izuku a watery smile as she wiped away his tears. "Oh, Zuku, I'm so sorry," she said, pulling away fully and wiping at her eyes with her sleeve. "Anyways, this isn't gonna be about me. We need to talk about you," she said, her voice firm. Izuku watched as she went to the kitchen and got the food, setting the table as he resisted the urge to help, his fingers twitching. But a look from his mother told him he shouldn't. Useless. Inko smiled as she sat across from him, her eyes red from crying. She looked like she'd start crying again any second. Inko took a deep breath and looked away from Izuku, and Izuku felt something. He didn't know what, he just knew that it hurt. He wondered whether he couldn't identify it because he hadn't felt it before, or because he felt it too often. After a minute of analyzing, he concluded that it was the second option. It was something he had felt a lot when he had first discovered his quirklessness, going to his best friend and discovering that they considered him unworthy. Then again, he was unworthy. It was nearly enough to make him get up from the table. Izuku was beginning to suspect his mother had a psychic quirk because she seemed to know that he was about to excuse himself. She laid her hand on his prosthetic, and Izuku couldn't help but tense up. Inko smiled as she looked at the prosthetic. "It seems like you have a good friend," Inko said quietly, looking at Izuku's face. Izuku began nodding. "Yeah, I have a few good friends. They're great." Inko nodded, quietly removing her hand from his prosthetic. "They must be happy to have you, yeah?" she asked, looking at Izuku. Izuku immediately knew she was looking for information, but couldn't help but wonder what she was looking for information about. "I'm happy to have them," Izuku answered, wiping at the wet tracks on his face with his natural hand. Inko frowned but nodded. "Izuku, what do you dream of being?" she asked, her voice far away as she stared over Izuku's shoulder. Izuku went to answer he paused, freezing in the middle of his word. Because it wasn't true. He didn't dream of being a hero. He dreamed of becoming someone who could help people. He dreamed of helping everyone. He dreamed of the impossible. Always the impossible and improbable. So he answered, "I dream of being someone people can depend on." Izuku's voice was quiet as he was struck with this sudden revelation. Inko nodded, looking at Izuku. "Izuku, I'm so proud of you. I'm so proud of you. I've been proud of you since you were little," Inko said, her voice serious as she looked into Izuku's eyes, and Izuku found himself unable to look away, listening to his mother. "I wasn't proud because of some quirk you got. I wasn't proud because you were stronger. I was proud because every day, despite being quirkless, you walked out that door with your head held high, ready to face the new day," Inko said. And Izuku could feel the meaning behind every one of those words. Izuku felt something clog up his throat and swallowed, his throat suddenly dry and his eyes filled with water. Inko didn't let up. "I was proud because you were smarter, you never gave up. You found something you could do better than anyone and even then branched into other things. And I'm still proud of you. Izuku, I'm so proud of you," Inko said, standing and walking over to her son and hugging him. Izuku cried as he hugged her. "I'm sorry, Izuku, that I wasn't here more," Inko said as she held Izuku, running a hand up and down his back. Her voice was quiet, and Izuku didn't hear it over his crying. She silently rubbed his back until he stopped crying. Izuku sniffled and rubbed his face before his mom left to get tissues and he used those. He looked at her and smiled. "Mom, you know, about my arm. Obviously, I kind of felt that I should." Explain, Izuku said quietly, deciding to reveal who he was to his mother. Izuku choked up, terrified of being rejected by his mother. Izuku faltered, feeling his fear begin to take over. Useless shouldn't say anything. Useless should shut up and sit down. Useless needs to sit out because useless is useless. Useless should. Izuku was interrupted by his mother placing a hand on his. He looked at her and blinked at the pure, unadulterated concern he saw in her eyes. She gently placed his hand between both of her own. Normally I'd let you reveal it yourself at a pace that you're comfortable with, but you need to tell me because you've already gotten hurt from this. I want to know what I'm dealing with before you get more hurt, she said, her voice soft and comforting, but also telling Izuku that he needed to tell her. It was no longer optional. I'm the healer. Izuku rushed out in a mashed together jumble. Inko blinked, before sighing as she shifted. I need to hear it coherently, Inko said quietly. Inko paused, thinking that over. She looked at Izuku, before gently laying her hand on his. Izuku looked at Inko, who smiled at him. Izuku, I'm so proud of you. So proud of you. I don't think I'll ever be able to express how proud of you I am. Inko said, eyes watery as she smiled. Izuku, do you know what they call you? They call you a hero. You're a hero, Izuku, Inko said, her voice quiet, strained. Izuku stared at his mom, his heart pounding in his ears and tears gathering in his eyes. I am not a hero, Izuku managed, his voice scratchy, and he felt like he was choking on the words. He felt like they were getting stuck, and he had to swallow once or twice to get the words out. And Inko looked like she had been struck. Her eyes widened and tears gathered, and she seemed like she was gonna cry for completely different reason. Suddenly Izuku felt horrible. I'm sorry, he said, reaching forward to try and comfort her, feeling sad that she thought he might be a hero and he had shattered her. Inko, on the other hand, suddenly realized how heavily broken her poor baby was. Her poor baby. He was more of a hero than some of the heroes she had seen previously. Her poor baby was worried for her and apologizing for stating something that probably hurt him more to say than it hurt her. Inko pulled her child out of the chair and into her arms, letting out a choked sob. Izuku shifted, on his knees as his mother dragged him down, out of the chair and onto the floor as she collapsed, her arms wrapped around his neck as he froze. Izuku didn't know why she was crying. He hated this. She shouldn't have hoped for him to be a hero. She should know he's useless. Then Inko shifted backward, smiling at Izuku and kissing his cheek. Oh, Izuku, Inko said, her voice quiet and strained. You're one of the bravest, strongest heroes I've ever met, and I am so proud of you for being who you are, Izuku. She hugged him, and Izuku felt everything tilt. The world shudder, but it was only for him. The world collapsed and was rebuilt, but only to him. Izuku felt like he had fallen apart. His mom thought he was a hero. Was he a hero? He couldn't possibly be a hero. All Might said people without power can't be a hero. He had no power. He couldn't possibly be a hero. But if he was a hero, did that mean he was useless? A hero. Could a hero be useless? Could a hero be whatever useless was? No, not possible. He wasn't a hero. He was useless. He couldn't possibly be a hero. Useless was always told no. He couldn't be a hero. He shouldn't play so rough with Kachin. He should sit to the side. Useless should shut up, sit down. Useless. His mom couldn't possibly mean him. No, impossible. But she had said it. Izuku, you're one of the bravest, strongest heroes I've ever met. Not possible. Never. How could Izuku be a hero? He was useless. Izuku felt tears streaming down his face, pulling back and putting his hand to his face. Izuku nearly jumped at the feeling of cool metal on his face as he touched himself with his prosthetic. Izuku blinked and looked at his mother, who seemed to be waiting. Her arms were drawn back against her body as she stared at him expectantly, eyes still wet with tears. Izuku didn't stop crying, tears streaming down his face as he blinked and looked down at his hands. How could he be a hero? Was he wrong? Inko kissed Izuku's cheek, seeming to know the boy would need a bit to process, though she would never tell him she knew because she had tried saying his name a few times and he hadn't responded. Izuku took her hands as she stood, helping him up as she smiled at him. Eat a bit, and then you can do as you please. Izuku nodded, pausing after a second and looking at his mother. Do you want to meet Dusk? Izuku asked quietly, hesitant in his actions going forward. Inko looked at him, surprised. After a second she smiled and nodded. I'd love to, she confirmed verbally, making Izuku beam. After the two had eaten and Izuku had gotten into his vigilante outfit, which was honestly such a shock to him. The little outfit he had thrown together out of whatever he found in his closet was now considered a vigilante outfit. It was weird to think about, so he didn't think about it. He smiled as he saw his mother, his eyes sparkling as Izuku felt the feeling he was reacquainting himself with. It was something bright and warm, a bit like hope, but more tentative. A shaky bridge that grounded the teenager in a reality that others could reach him in. Izuku walked out of the house and wasn't surprised to see Dusk walk up to him. She mewed and rubbed against his legs, purring as she did. Izuku crouched down and ran a hand down her back, smiling as she looked at his mother. Inko crouched down and offered her hand forward, letting Dusk walk over and sniff it. After a second, the cat walked over and nudged her hand, accepting the touch. Inko smiled and ran her hand down Dusk's back. Izuku looked at Inko, smiling happily as he watched Dusk and Inko interact. He then stood and Dusk trotted over to his feet, twining around them and walking between them as Izuku hugged his mother. Inko smiled at Izuku. I'll see about getting some more time off of work. You make sure to take care of yourself when I'm not here, too. Okay, Inko said, looking at Izuku seriously. She had heard from the doctors about his condition, including how dangerously underweight the teen was. Izuku was a bit surprised and had enough presence of mind to look sheepish at his mother's obvious reference to his penchant for ignoring useless. She had always struggled to see why useless was useless, so Izuku didn't mind acting in front of her sometimes. Though, now he had to think about some of this. It felt like things were happening so quickly sometimes, even though it has been over a year now. Over a year since the time he found a blue-haired man and helped because Izuku always helped. Izuku couldn't do anything but help. It was all Izuku wanted to do. He looked around as the buildings got worse, as the places got shadier. But people didn't slink away when they saw him as they might have last year. The teenager was welcomed with smiles. A few of the strays that last year would have been completely gone were wandering around, with Dusk strolling confidently next to Izuku, her tail flicking and swaying behind her. People waved to the vigilante, who smiled eagerly and waved back, as he had always done. He had a kid who had gotten a scraped knee come up to him and tell him that their parent had told them that he'd make it go away. The teen had smiled and crouched down, offering his natural arm. The kid seemed to notice his mechanical arm after they had taken his other hand and began to ask about it. Izuku explained that he had gotten it by doing something to help someone. The kid had been surprised, but smiled and excitedly began talking to Izuku about their favorite hero. It was some hero Izuku had heard of and had an analysis of. Not that there were many heroes Izuku didn't have an analysis of. Izuku smiled and pulled his hand away after he was done. All done, he said excitedly with a bright smile. He stood as the kid thanked him, ruffling their hair casually before the kid ran off to their parent, who smiled at him. He smiled back before continuing with his usual walk. It was weird how suddenly aware he was of these changes. Just yesterday he had walked this way without noticing every change that had happened. Maybe he was feeling sentimental. That would explain it. Izuku sighed as he stretched, before waving his hand at Dusk. Go ahead and do whatever you usually do, girl. I don't know whether we'll have anything too exciting today, Izuku said honestly before putting his bag down on the ground carefully. Afterward, he flopped down on the ground, making a small noise as he smacked his head against the brick wall behind him. He winced and rubbed his head, muttering curses at the brick wall as he pulled out his laptop. He didn't have time to open his laptop before a familiar head of blue-white hair appeared at the entrance. The man walked into the alleyway that Izuku had set up shop in for today and smiled. Hey, healer. Izuku smiled behind his mask at the first person he had healed. Hey, Shigaraki, he said easily. Shigaraki seemed to pause at that, before sighing, call me Tamura. Izuku was surprised and smiled eagerly. Okay, he said happily as he put away his laptop, returning it to the bag it had been retrieved from. Izuku paused at a morbid thought he had, looking at Tamura. Tamura stared at him for a second, before saying, no. Izuku huffed, but Tamura, you were so excited to test my ideas when I first told you about them. Izuku protested as he sat forward, his legs crossed and his hands tucked into the spot within. Tamura crossed his arms. Until you decided that if anything needed a human test subject that you would be the test subject, Tamura said, glaring down at Izuku. Izuku pouted slightly. I don't see why you care that much, Izuku admitted as he looked away. Izuku got the feeling Tamura didn't know either, but Tamura instead answered, anyway, kid, anything new happen? Izuku nodded eagerly as he looked at Tamura again, beginning to explain what had happened today. Tamura seemed a bit nervous as Izuku explained how being called a hero made him feel as best as he could. Izuku finished it with a small admittance, something he had been denying during middle school but had come back full force during these conversations. I knew it was delusional, you know, becoming a hero and all. It was really a crazy idea that I should have given up as soon as I realized I could barely defend myself from playground bullies, let alone save someone else from actual villains. But I don't think I ever gave up on being a hero. Not really. Even after I had resolved not to be a hero, I still ran over to help you and didn't call an ambulance when I knew you were dangerous and injured. Izuku sighed as he looked away. It's honestly crazy. Like, even after I helped you, I continued helping people. Just anyone that stumbled upon me. Really, what was I thinking? Izuku huffed as he curled up, wrapping his arms around his knees. Tamura hummed as he seemed to consider what Izuku was saying. Well, I don't think any logical hero would blame you for being bullied. Not every hero came out at 5 years old kicking ass, and I think it's very natural for you to hold on to childhood dreams. A lot of people have childhood dreams that, if they got the chance to, they would fulfill in a heartbeat, Tamura said, rubbing Izuku's back gently as he looked at the teen. I think you were thinking about how you wanted to help people. I think that's all being a hero was about from the start. Helping people. And, not to start preaching whatever the fuck Stain is on about, but I think that makes you more of a hero than some of the heroes in the Hero Commission. Izuku sighed at the mention of the commission, and it seemed like Tamura almost laughed at that reaction. Izuku huffed, the commission is so corrupt. Like, heroes can basically pay the commission enough to make sure that the number of damages they cause is under the amount that the villain would cause running free, even if it's a giant lie. Or to play up something like a small theft into a jewelry robbery. Honestly, it's insane to see some of the things they cover up, Izuku said, letting out a bit of his frustration at the entity that controlled the hero licenses. Tamura chuckled. I'm not gonna ask how you got all this information, but I will say you have some impressive skills for someone who's best known for healing people. Tamura teased the teen as he hid his face behind his knees. And, anyway, you're changing the Hero Commission. It's got everyone both underground and in normal society going crazy, Tamura said with an excited laugh. Izuku huffed, muttering, but I'm not doing that, everyone else is. Tamura stared at Izuku with a deadpan look, and the teen looked away. It's true, the teen claimed easily, truly believing that he was playing a lot smaller of a role in this than everyone was making it seem like he was. The main reason the public is so angry at the commission right now would be because you're in danger. I reckon it wouldn't take much more for the public to decide that the commission building needs to come down to make a point. Izuku made a noise in alarm. Surely not. That's insane. I'm not special at all. They can't be thinking of tearing the commission building down. Oh no. The teen quickly began dissolving into worries. Izuku was rather quickly knocked out of his worries by the young adult next to him, pushing him over onto the ground. Don't worry about it, kid. Let the adults deal with something for once. You don't have to do everything by yourself, Tamura said, looking at the teenager who seemed to carry the world on his shoulders. Izuku stared at Tamura as if the man had spoken in a foreign language. Tamura sighed and stood. Anyway, I should head out before I scare off anyone else looking for your expertise. Just behave yourself, okay? Izuku huffed, wondering why both Tamura and Dabai seemed so concerned with him doing what they instructed. Usually, the villains were pretty chill about this stuff. Yeah, whatever. I'll behave, Tamura, Izuku said, waving off the young adult with his mechanical hand. Tamura stared at the hand for a few seconds, and Izuku watched him awkwardly, not knowing what to do in reaction. Tamura snapped out of it and smiled at him before leaving. It wasn't long before Dust jumped down from above with one of the usual lower-ranking heroes that he tended to sometimes. Izuku wondered how they'd handle him needing to do the whole hands-on training thing. He didn't have any requests that he might be able to draw upon because he wasn't at the sports festival. He wondered whether they'd have him work under Recovery Girl. That might be interesting. Izuku waved at the hero, watching them leave with a smile as he felt unease build in his chest. Something was happening, and Izuku always seemed to be both in the middle of it and a bystander to it all. Izuku just focused on helping, hoping everyone he cared about made it out alive. He swore that he would make sure they all made it out alive. Izuku returned to school and his friends grabbed him and dragged him to the side almost immediately. Monoma seemed especially excited. Izuku tilted his head as he looked at the boy. It had been a week since his conversation with his mother and Tamura. He was also scheduled to talk with Mr. Aizawa about careers again. Izuku looked at his friends as Ochako began excitedly. So, we were talking last night on the chat. Izuku interrupted. What chat? He was quite curious. He hadn't heard about a chat. Todoroki glared at Ochako. Nothing. We'll show it to you later, Todoroki said. And Izuku got the distinct feeling that this chat was supposed to be a secret between his friends. Monoma continued anyway. Your friends from Wana had a good idea for once. Monoma said this like it was an accomplishment, and got an offended look from Shinso, and Todoroki rolled his eyes slightly. Izuku was happy to see Todoroki showing his emotions more. He had been rather stiff and awkward, not knowing how to move his face for certain emotions when he had first entered school because he had been homeschooled by his father to be the best hero he could be. And this did not include any socialization. At least, that was how Endeavor would put it. Izuku hummed as he processed what Monoma said. What do you mean? What was this idea? He tilted his head a bit. Monoma nodded, and the whole group seemed glad Izuku wasn't focusing on the fact that Ochako had mentioned a chat. Well, I wanted to ask if you'd give me a piece of your hair so we can see how your quirk works, Monoma proposed, smiling as if he had just solved a world issue. Izuku tilted his head, before shrugging. Sure, he said casually before he took out a knife from his pocket and cut off a small lock of his hair. He offered it to Monoma, who pulled out a pocket he had that could attach and detach to a belt that was part of his new hero costume. Izuku placed it in and watched Monoma touch it. Monoma seemed surprised for a second, shifting backward and flexing his hands, staring at them in amazement. Izuku tilted his head, watching the boy. Monoma looked at Izuku, but decided not to say anything. I'll test this during class today. See how it goes, Monoma said excitedly, before running off. Izuku watched, wondering what the other staring at his hands was for. Izuku hummed, before turning to his other classmates. So what was this chat? 5 minutes later, Izuku was added to a chat. Protect Izuwu. Frostburn changed Useless Useful's nickname to Izuwu. Izuwu, seriously? Weak for sleep, obviously. Izuku chuckled slightly, putting away his phone as he turned his attention to his mechanical arm. He opened a small panel on the arm and adjusted the mode as he headed towards the classroom, his friends following behind him. He heard a noise indicating that someone had messaged in the group chat, but didn't pay much attention to it. They went to class and did as they usually did. Though Izuku was told to sit out certain things for health reasons, it was specifically because of how underweight he was. Izuku was allowed to do other things, and he worked on training himself. Then their upperclassmen came into the class and began to talk to them. It was so cool. Izuku could relate a lot to Tagata, otherwise known as Lemillion, because he wanted to save 1,000,000 people. Though, it seemed like the older man had gone through a weird change in his quirk. Izuku didn't ask too many questions, because it seemed like any questions about his quirk's changes made Tagata uncomfortable. Izuku was allowed to join in his classmates' attempts to beat Tagata. Izuku was able to tell that Tagata seemed to go for people who were in the same spot as before he emerged, so he made sure to tell everyone to scatter whenever Tagata went under. However, Tagata had come after Izuku after realizing that Izuku was helping everyone else. Izuku had ended up wrapping his arm in a cloth-like material stored in his mechanical arm, pulling the punch to the side and quickly letting go, throwing the older teen off balance. Afterward, however, Tagata had quickly recovered and managed to beat Izuku by tripping him up. After that, everyone was taken down relatively easily, and Izuku wrote in a notebook he had, glad to have gotten a look at Tagata's quirk. The Big Three, while talked about often and every so often appearing in interviews, had very limited media presence because it was technically illegal to film them without their express permission, thus resulting in anyone who attempted to air footage of them getting legal action taken upon them. However, Izuku did have what he could find on them in his journal, so he was happy to be able to update that information. Izuku jumped a bit when Mr. Aizawa placed a hand on his shoulder, unable to suppress it as he looked up at the man. He sighed a bit and made a head motion towards the door. Izuku nodded and followed the man out of the training area. Here are a few different careers based on what you gave me. Mr. Aizawa gave Izuku a few papers, and Izuku looked them over. After a while of looking them over, he looked at Aizawa. I don't have to choose right now, right? Izuku looked at Aizawa, pursing his lips a bit. Aizawa nodded, sighing as he shifted backward. Also, Tagata wants to watch you tonight, Aizawa said, looking at Izuku. Izuku looked at him back. Okay. Izuku looked away, not knowing what to say. He couldn't help but wonder why Tagata would want to watch him. Izuku watched Aizawa, wondering why he was looking at him so intensely. Mr. Aizawa, Izuku questioned hesitantly. The teacher blinked, before sighing. Oh, yeah, I meant to say this earlier, when we were talking about hero names. Izuku nodded in understanding yes. He asked, wondering what the teacher could have possibly wanted to say. Aizawa looked away. To the public, you're already a hero, kid, and you have a lot of support. You shouldn't walk around claiming you aren't a hero. Aizawa shrugged, because a lot of people would say you're a hero in all the ways that matter. Izuku paused, wondering why people kept calling him a hero. Why? Why would they call him this? Were they tempting him with this title? No, his mother wouldn't do that. And Mr. Aizawa wouldn't do that. It isn't like when he'd defend a kid with a weak quirk and the others would mockingly ask whether Useless fancied himself a hero now. Izuku numbly nodded at Aizawa after realizing he had paused for longer than was socially acceptable. After Aizawa nodded back, with Izuku missing the weird look the teacher gave, the teen turned and made his way back into training, just as numb as he was before. His classmates asked him to heal them whenever they got too beat up for their tastes, until Aizawa chased them off, chastising them that they would rarely have a healing quirk on the battlefield. After school was over, Izuku exited through the front gates, because there were no teachers out searching for him. Though, he did notice Mirio following him. The older student had his group of friends with him and was discussing something. Izuku generally gave his friends the slip before his walk home. He wasn't all that interesting, and he still wasn't used to having people wanting to talk to him. People used to avoid him, afraid of catching quirklessness. Izuku sighed, noticing that Mirio had appeared next to him, and blinked slightly. Had he really been that distracted? Why don't you slow down? Tagata inquired, looking down every few seconds. After a pause, the smaller teen answered, What do you mean? I'm just walking. Izuku was confused, wondering what the other was talking about. Tagata looked at him, before shaking his head and apparently deciding it wasn't worth it, which was fine by Izuku. Izuku walked past Dusk, who was sitting on the stairs up to his house, and mewed, walking beside him naturally. Izuku quietly wondered how Dusk managed to find him. She seemed to just find him all the time, no matter whether he was on the other side of the city. He was pretty sure he had seen her walking around UA once or twice, but that could also be his eyes playing tricks on him. Dusk silently padded beside him as he went to his room. He changed into his vigilante outfit and grabbed a sandwich his mom had put in the fridge with a note. Izuku felt like it should have been vaguely threatening, but he also tended to villains who could be a lot more threatening on a nightly basis. He sighed as he brushed a hand through his hair, feeling his hands catch on some knots. He hummed, pausing. He should probably take a shower. He had been so busy lately and things had thrown him off kilter. He felt like he wasn't in the same world like this was some dream and he'd wake up and be useless again. No, useless still. He couldn't possibly not be useless. But his traitorous thoughts whispered to him, useless couldn't be a hero. Why would useless be considered a hero if he was useless? Was he useless? He couldn't be anything else, could he? He hummed, trying to recall whether he had made the appointments necessary for therapy. He was supposed to do that. He was pretty sure that Nezu was going to talk to him about the agreement that seemed to be unspoken between everyone in UA. Useless shook his head and unwrapped the sandwich, taking a bite and chewing carefully as he slid down the rail that was on the side of the stairs, nearly falling off, but recovering rather smoothly as Dusk followed his example. She was a lot smoother on the dismount and jumped onto his head, causing him to stumble forward as he swallowed, nearly choking on his bite of sandwich. Izuku was caught by Tagata and smiled as he looked up at the older student. Dusk jumped off his head, her tail swaying as she seemed to look back at him smugly. Izuku stuck his tongue out at the cat as he pushed himself up. He sighed as he quickly set off, humming to himself as he did. That night it was a busy night, a lot of his usual customers and then some. And then his most common visitor came and Tagata nearly punched the blue-haired man. Only Izuku physically getting between the two managed to get them to calm down. Izuku sighed as he looked between the two adults. Okay, Tagata, I know this probably seems weird, but remember, I heal everyone. It doesn't matter if they're a villain, a hero, or a vigilante. I just want everyone to not have to suffer. Tamura, it's fine. He isn't about to arrest me. And if you truly want to discuss things, you know that I'll send him away, Izuku soothed. Tamura huffed, but nodded at the blonde hero, before pulling Izuku over to him. Neither of the two conspiring acknowledged the blonde hero's instinctive attempt to stop Tamura from touching Izuku. Izuku waved his mechanical hand at Tagata. You go, you've seen enough, and I'm sure you've also heard more than enough. Izuku glared at Tagata, who had the awareness to look sheepish. Tagata quickly left the area, with Dusk following him. After Dusk returned, Izuku petted her. Thank you, girl. He opened a can of cat food. He placed it down and sat on the ground next to it, leaning against the building as Tamura sat next to him. Tamura spoke. I needed to talk to someone. One of mine got obliterated today. I don't think you know her. Magni, if that rings any bells. Izuku hummed and considered it for a second, before nodding. I've heard her mentioned a few times, the teen admitted easily. I don't think I met her yet. If you don't mind me asking, how'd it happen? And the teen listened to the tale of a man with a mask who was averse to touch and quirks. He listened and comforted the villain as he told the tale of seeing one of his recruits turn to a mist of blood before his eyes. Tamura wasn't necessarily upset that Magni had gotten killed. He was upset at the reminder of how easy it was for a villain to be killed, at how easy it was for them to disappear and never to be heard of again. He listened intently as the man fumed and fussed, and then he watched as red eyes focused on him. If he tries to approach you, Izuku, leave him alone, Tamura said, almost growling out the last part as he gripped the teen's shoulder. Izuku stared at the man before him and dwelled on the question he had asked before. Why did the man care? Useless wasn't supposed to have people care. People shouldn't look at Useless like how Tamura was looking at him, with a look that told him that if he didn't listen and got himself killed, Tamura would probably tear the world apart. Izuku blinked and smiled. Okay, he lied. He could never turn down anyone who came to him for healing. It would probably get him killed someday. Tamura deadpanned, staring at Izuku in a way that told him that his lie didn't go unnoticed. Izuku just smiled tiredly at the man. He sighed and rolled his eyes, before releasing Izuku and sitting back. Just be careful, the man amended as he leaned against the wall next to the teen. The teen nodded in silent consideration, but there was an equally silent unease. Tamura silently felt like he was watching history be written. Izuku would burn this country to the ground if he wasn't careful, and Tamura couldn't tell whether he was jealous or proud.